Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for being here tonight. It truly means a lot that you choose to watch this channel. I've got a spine-chilling collection of scary stories set in the rain for you to enjoy. But before we dive in, take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let the darkness take over. And hey, if you enjoy these stories, don't forget to subscribe, never miss out on any of the eerie tales that we share. Sit back, relax, and let's get started. Emma had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just her boyfriend Sam, and their two closest friends, Rachel and Mark. They had all grown tired of the noisy, crowded city and needed an escape. The idea of being surrounded by nature, with nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the chirping of birds, sounded like the perfect reset. They arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon, their car loaded with tents, coolers, and hiking gear. The drive had taken them deeper into the forest than any of them had expected, but the farther they went, the more excited Emma felt. This place was special, untouched, a hidden gem far off the beaten path. The towering trees formed a thick canopy overhead, and the forest floor was a lush, green carpet of moss and ferns. A river, hidden somewhere in the distance, provided a soothing background sound as it trickled over rocks. As they unpacked the car, Sam smiled at Emma and said, "This is going to be awesome. Just what we need." She returned his smile, though a strange feeling nagged at her. The isolation was both exhilarating and unnerving. They hadn't seen another car for hours, and the forest was so dense it felt like they were the only people in the world. Emma loved the outdoors, but there was something about this place, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. They set up their tents in a small clearing near the edge of a thick cluster of pine trees. The air was cool, and as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, the temperature dropped noticeably. Sam and Mark worked on building a fire while Emma and Rachel unpacked the food, chatting excitedly about the hikes they had planned for the next day. The sky above was a brilliant orange, fading into purple, and soon the first stars began to peek through the twilight. By the time the fire was crackling, night had fully descended. The forest around them was pitch black, with only the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the trees. Rachel leaned back in her camping chair and sighed. "This is perfect, isn't it? No stress, no noise. Just us and nature." Emma nodded, but she still couldn't shake the odd sense of unease that had settled in her stomach. The darkness beyond the firelight seemed thicker here, almost suffocating. She stared out into the trees, straining to see anything beyond the glow of the campfire, but the woods were an inky void. After a while, they began to tell stories, typical campfire tales. Sam recounted a creepy urban legend from their hometown, and Mark followed up with a ghost story that had them all laughing nervously. But as the night wore on, the laughter faded. Something about the oppressive silence of the woods began to weigh on them all. Emma couldn't help but feel like they were being watched. "Does anyone else feel weird?" she asked, breaking the silence. The words hung in the air, met with uneasy glances from the others. Sam shrugged, trying to keep the mood light. "Come on, it's just the woods. We're not used to this kind of quiet. That's all." But Emma wasn't convinced. The silence wasn't normal. It wasn't peaceful, it was heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Even the usual sounds of nocturnal creatures, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the hoot of an owl, were absent. Rachel rubbed her arms as if to ward off a sudden chill. "Yeah, it is kind of weird. Shouldn't we at least hear crickets or something?" Mark stood up, grabbing a stick and poking at the fire. "You guys are just spooking yourselves. We're out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing here but trees and deer." But Emma wasn't so sure. As they continued sitting around the fire, the unease gnawed at her. She kept glancing toward the darkness beyond the circle of light, her mind playing tricks on her, imagining shadows moving just out of sight. Hours passed, and they eventually decided to call it a night. Sam poured water over the fire, and the campsite was plunged into darkness, save for the faint beams of their flashlights as they retreated to their tents. Inside the tent, Emma tried to sleep, but every rustle of the trees outside set her on edge. She lay there, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, listening to Sam's soft breathing beside her. After what felt like an eternity, she finally began to drift off. That's when she heard it. At first, it was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, a soft whisper, like someone speaking just outside the tent. Emma's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. "Sam," she whispered, nudging him awake. "Did you hear that?" Sam grunted, half asleep. "Hear what?" Emma held her breath, listening intently. For a moment there was nothing, and then she heard it again, clearer this time. "We see you." The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably human. Emma's blood ran cold. She sat up, shaking Sam harder. "Sam, listen." The whisper came again, sending a chill down Emma's spine. It was closer now, as if whoever or whatever was speaking was right outside the tent. "We see you." Sam sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What the hell?" he muttered, grabbing his flashlight. He shone the beam toward the tent flap, but there was no one there. Before they could react, the zipper of the tent began to move slowly, deliberately, as if someone was opening it from the outside. Emma's heart leaped into her throat. She grabbed Sam's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Sam, what is that?" The zipper continued to descend, the sound impossibly loud in the otherwise silent night. When it finally reached the bottom, the flap of the tent hung open, revealing only the pitch-black forest beyond. But Emma could feel it, a presence just outside, watching them. Sam shone his flashlight into the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing. "Is someone out there?" he called, his voice trembling slightly. No response. Emma's mind raced. She was sure she had heard the voice. There had been words, not just the wind. "We need to go," she whispered urgently. Sam nodded, and they quickly gathered their things. As they stepped out of the tent, they saw Rachel and Mark emerging from theirs, both looking equally spooked. "You guys heard that, right?" Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark was gripping a flashlight tightly, his eyes scanning the woods. "Yeah, we heard it. Someone's messing with us." They stood there in the darkness, the cold night air biting at their skin. The forest around them was impossibly still. And then, from somewhere deep within the trees, the whispering returned. "We see you. We see you." The voice echoed through the woods, surrounding them, coming from every direction at once. Panic surged through Emma as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. She glanced toward the trees and froze. They weren't alone. Dozens of figures stood just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the darkness. They were tall and thin, their bodies swaying unnaturally as they watched the group. Their faces were obscured by shadow, but their eyes, bright, glowing eyes, were fixed on Emma and her friends. "We need to get out of here," Sam said, his voice shaking as he backed toward the car. The others didn't argue. They grabbed their bags and stumbled through the campsite, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they ran toward the car. The whispering followed them, growing louder and more frenzied. "We see you. We see you." The figures began to move, slowly at first, but then with terrifying speed. They seemed to glide over the forest floor, their long limbs reaching out as they closed in on the fleeing group. Emma's heart raced as they reached the car. Sam fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as the figures drew closer. "Hurry," Rachel cried, glancing over her shoulder. Finally, Sam managed to unlock the doors, and they all piled in, slamming the doors shut behind them. Sam started the engine, and the car roared to life. He floored the gas, the tires kicking up dirt as they sped down the narrow road, away from the campsite. As they drove, Emma looked out the window, her breath fogging up the glass. The figures were still there, standing at the edge of the road, watching them disappear into the night. For a moment, the whispering faded. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the pounding of Emma's heart in her ears. But then, just as they reached the main road, she heard it one last time, faint but unmistakable. "We see you." They never went back to that forest, and Emma never forgot the feeling of being watched by the shadows. Even now, years later, she sometimes hears that whisper in her dreams. Just like Emma and her friends tried to escape the forest of shadows, don't let these terrifying stories escape your attention. If you enjoy being on the edge of your seat, subscribe to our channel and be the first to hear the latest chilling stories. Trust us, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Mira had been planning her solo retreat for months. After years of pushing herself through grueling workdays, endless emails, and countless sleepless nights, she needed a break. So when she found a listing for a secluded cabin deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, it seemed like a dream come true. The pictures showed a cozy, wooden lodge nestled among tall pines, a fireplace crackling inside, and a view of the distant peaks that took her breath away. It was perfect a place to write, reflect, and recharge. The drive up the mountain was longer than expected, the narrow roads winding through forests so dense the sunlight barely touched the ground. As she climbed higher, the signal on her phone flickered and then disappeared altogether. She glanced at the no service message on her screen but shrugged it off. This was what she had wanted: complete isolation. No distractions. No interruptions. By the time she arrived at the cabin, dusk had already settled, casting long shadows across the trees. Mira parked the car and stepped out, breathing in the crisp mountain air. The cabin was exactly as it had been in the photos: rustic, charming, and surrounded by a thick canopy of trees. She smiled to herself, grabbing her bags and heading inside. The interior of the cabin was just as inviting. Wooden beams lined the ceiling, a stone fireplace sat at the center of the living room, and large windows looked out onto the sprawling forest. It was perfect. After unpacking her things, Mira made herself a cup of tea and settled down by the fire with her laptop, ready to begin her long-awaited writing project. Hours passed, and the only sounds were the crackling fire and the occasional rustling of branches outside. Mira felt herself slipping into a peaceful rhythm, the words flowing easily onto the screen. But as the night grew darker, she began to notice something odd. The rustling outside wasn't just the wind. She paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, listening carefully. There was again a soft scraping sound, like footsteps moving through the brush. Mira set her laptop aside and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their branches casting eerie shadows across the ground. But beyond that, there was nothing. With a shake of her head, she turned back to her writing. Just nerves, she told herself. She hadn't been this isolated in years, and it was probably playing tricks on her. Still, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that crept up her spine. She glanced at the time. It was nearly midnight. Maybe it was best to get some sleep and pick up her writing in the morning. After shutting down her laptop, Mira padded across the wooden floors to the bedroom. The cabin was surprisingly warm, the fire casting a cozy glow throughout the space. She climbed into bed, pulling the thick quilt up to her chin. The silence of the forest was almost unnerving now, with no cars, no city noise, just the deep, oppressive quiet of nature. She closed her eyes, trying to let the tension slip away, and soon enough, she drifted off to sleep. Somewhere in the early hours of the morning, she woke suddenly. The room was cold, much colder than before. Mira shivered, pulling the quilt tighter around her, her breath visible in the icy air. Confused, She glanced toward the fireplace, but the embers were still glowing softly. The heat from the fire should have kept the cabin warm. It was then that she heard it. A floorboard creaked, not far from where she lay. Mira's heart began to pound, the sound unmistakable. Something was inside the cabin. She sat up slowly, her pulse racing in her ears. The creaking continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone were walking down the hallway toward her room. She held her breath, straining to listen. Another creak, closer this time. Mira's mind raced. She was miles away from anyone, with no cell service, no landline, no way to call for help. And whoever or whatever was in the cabin with her was getting closer. She threw the blankets off, her bare feet hitting the cold floor as she tiptoed toward the door. The creaking stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air had been sucked out of the room. She pressed her ear to the wooden door, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for any sound that might give her a clue as to who or what was out there. Then, without warning, the door handle turned. Mira's blood turned to ice. She stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror as the door slowly creaked open. But no one stood in the doorway. The hallway beyond was empty, just the faint glow of the fireplace in the living room casting long shadows on the walls. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she grabbed her flashlight from the nightstand, flicking it on and sweeping the beam through the hallway. Nothing. But she knew someone had been turning that handle. She stepped cautiously into the hallway, the wooden floor creaking beneath her feet. Every muscle in her body was tense, her senses heightened as she crept toward the living room. The fire had nearly burned out, leaving the cabin in near darkness. And then she saw it. On the floor by the window, muddy footprints, large, heavy, and unmistakably human. They led from the window to the center of the living room and then disappeared, as if whoever had made them had simply vanished into thin air. Mira's heart raced as she scanned the room, her flashlight trembling in her hand. There was no sign of anyone. The front door was still locked, the windows were closed, but the footprints were fresh, the mud still wet. And then she heard it again, a creak, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing, soft and shallow. Someone was still in the cabin. She whirled around, her flashlight beam darting across the room, but it caught nothing but shadows. The breathing grew louder, coming from behind her now, just inches away. Mira froze, her throat tightening in terror. She didn't dare turn around. Then, in a voice so faint, it was almost a whisper, she heard it. "Get out." Mira didn't need to be told twice. She bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock, her hands shaking as she yanked it open and stumbled out into the cold night air. The forest seemed even darker now, the trees looming over her like silent sentinels. But she didn't care. She ran, her heart pounding in her chest, not stopping until she reached her car. The engine roared to life, and she sped down the mountain road, not daring to look back. The cabin disappeared behind her, swallowed by the darkness of the woods, but the terror lingered. She couldn't explain what had happened, but one thing was certain: she was never going back. The next day, Mira made her way to the nearest town, her nerves still frayed. She told herself it had been a dream, an overactive imagination brought on by the isolation. But when she stopped at a small diner for breakfast, her story was met with knowing glances. "That cabin's been empty for years," the waitress said, pouring her coffee with a sympathetic smile. "No one's stayed there since. Well, since the accident." Mira blinked. "Accident?" The waitress nodded. "A man died up there. Some kind of hunting accident," they said. "But folks around here, they think something else happened. Some say his spirit never left." Mira felt a chill creep up her spine. The muddy footprints, the creaking floorboards, the voice in the dark. It all made sense now. She had felt it, she had seen it. The stranger in the cabin wasn't just in her mind. He was still there, waiting. Derek had never been one to believe in ghost stories. Whenever his friends would talk about haunted places or creepy legends, he'd shrug it off, laughing at their superstitions. But when his best friend, Kyle, convinced him to go camping in Red Valley, Derek's skepticism was about to be put to the test. Red Valley wasn't on any official map. It was one of those places that people whispered about, a secluded area deep in the mountains, miles away from the nearest town. The locals had their stories about it, a forgotten village, abandoned decades ago after a series of strange disappearances. Some said the valley was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who vanished. Others claimed that anyone who ventured there was never seen again. Kyle, however, saw it as the ultimate adventure. "Come on, Derek," he had said, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "It's just an old legend. You don't seriously believe that stuff, do you?" And so, after much persuasion, Derek had reluctantly agreed. A weekend in the wilderness didn't sound half bad, and he figured it would be a good chance to prove Kyle's ghost stories wrong once and for all. They packed their gear, loaded up the car, and drove out of town, leaving the world behind as they ventured into the unknown. The drive to Red Valley was longer than expected. The narrow dirt road twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the forest, the towering trees blocking out most of the sunlight. As they approached the valley, an eerie stillness settled over the landscape. Even the birds had stopped singing, and the wind barely rustled the leaves. Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were entering forbidden territory. "Are we close?" Derek asked, glancing at Kyle. Kyle checked the GPS, though the signal had been lost miles ago. "I think so. It should be just over this ridge." Derek nodded, though he couldn't shake the knot forming in his stomach. There was something unsettling about the silence that surrounded them. He told himself it was just nerves after all. Kyle had a way of hyping things up, and his mind was probably playing tricks on him. After what felt like hours, they finally arrived. Red Valley spread out before them, a wide, desolate stretch of land flanked by dark mountains on all sides. The air felt colder here, heavier. The sky was overcast, the sun barely managing to peek through the clouds. In the distance, Derek could just make out the remains of the old village, crumbled buildings and rotting wood, all overgrown with weeds and vines. "Here we are," Kyle announced, parking the car and stepping out. "This is going to be epic." Derek wasn't so sure. As he looked around, the valley seemed less like an exciting adventure and more like a place that time had forgotten. The air smelled damp, like decaying wood and earth, and there was an unsettling stillness that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Let's set up camp over there," Kyle said, pointing to a flat clearing near the edge of the valley. "We'll be close enough to the village to explore tomorrow." Derek hesitated for a moment, but eventually followed Kyle. They pitched their tent, gathered some wood, and started a small fire as the light began to fade. The temperature dropped quickly, and the valley was soon shrouded in a thick fog that rolled in from the mountains. So Kyle said, grinning across the fire at Derek, "You ready for some ghost hunting tomorrow?" Derek laughed, though it felt forced. "Yeah, right. We'll probably find some old raccoons and a few abandoned houses, but that's about it." Kyle smirked. "You'll see. People say this place is seriously haunted." Derek rolled his eyes. "I'll believe it when I see it." They stayed up late, sharing stories and laughing. The crackling of the fire, the only sound in the quiet night. But as the hours wore on, Derek found himself glancing over his shoulder more and more, his eyes drawn to the dark shapes of the mountains that loomed over them. Eventually, they called it a night. Kyle climbed into the tent first, leaving Derek to douse the fire. As he knelt by the embers, stirring the ashes, he heard something faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. He froze, straining to listen. Nothing. Shaking his head, Derek brushed it off. The valley was playing tricks on him, that's all. He stood up, but the sound came again this time, clearer. A soft, distant voice. He couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was whispering. Derek's heart began to pound in his chest. He turned toward the tent, ready to wake Kyle, but then he saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the fog, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Derek's breath caught in his throat. The figure was tall and thin, barely visible in the thick mist, but its shape was unmistakable. It stood perfectly still, watching him. For a moment, Derek couldn't move. His legs felt like they were rooted to the ground, his pulse racing. He blinked, and the figure was gone, vanished into the fog as if it had never been there. Kyle, Derek shouted, stumbling toward the tent. Kyle groaned, sitting up and rubbing his eyes. What's going on? There's someone out there, Derek gasped, pointing toward the spot where the figure had stood. Kyle frowned, grabbing a flashlight and stepping out of the tent. He scanned the area, but the beam revealed nothing but fog and shadows. Derek, there's no one here, Kyle said, his voice calm but irritated. It's just your imagination. I'm telling you, I saw someone, Derek insisted, his voice shaking. They were right there. Kyle sighed, shaking his head. Look, it's late, we're tired, and this place is creepy. Let's just go to bed, and we'll check it out in the morning, okay? Derek didn't argue. He wasn't sure what he had seen, or if he had seen anything at all. Maybe Kyle was right. Maybe his mind was playing tricks on him. But even as he climbed into his sleeping bag, Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The night passed slowly. Derek lay awake for hours, listening to the wind howl through the valley, the fog pressing up against the tent like a living thing. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of the leaves sent his heart racing. At some point, exhaustion finally overtook him, and he drifted into a restless sleep. He woke with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. The tent was freezing, the air so cold that he could see his breath. He reached for his phone, checking the time, 3:12 a.m. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Derek sat up, listening. Something wasn't right. And then he heard it, a soft tapping on the outside of the tent. Tap. 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 His blood ran cold. He held his breath, his eyes wide in the darkness. The tapping continued, steady and rhythmic, as if someone were lightly drumming their fingers against the fabric. Kyle, Derek whispered, his voice barely audible. No response. He reached over, shaking Kyle's shoulder. Kyle, wake up. Kyle stirred, groaning as he sat up. What's going on now? Listen, Derek whispered, his voice trembling. Kyle paused, his brow furrowing as he listened. The tapping had stopped. There's nothing, Derek, Kyle said, rubbing his face. You're freaking yourself out. But Derek wasn't so sure. His heart was racing, his skin prickling with cold sweat. He knew what he had heard, and then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. Kyle froze. His eyes widened as he finally heard it too. Without a word, Kyle grabbed the flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam outside. The fog had thickened, swirling around them in a ghostly dance. But there was no one there. The tapping stopped, replaced by an unnatural stillness that made Derek's skin crawl. I think we need to leave, Derek whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. Kyle hesitated, scanning the area one last time before nodding. Yeah, I think you're right. They packed up their gear as quickly and quietly as they could, their breath visible in the freezing air. The fog seemed to press in on them from all sides. and Derek couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. As they climbed into the car, Derek glanced back at the valley one last time. Through the swirling mist, he saw it again, a figure standing at the edge of the fog, watching them. It didn't move, didn't speak, but Derek knew it was real this time. He slammed the car door shut, his hands shaking as Kyle started the engine. They drove out of Red Valley in silence, the haunting presence of the figure lingering in Derek's mind. They never spoke about the trip again. But sometimes late at night, Derek still hears it, the soft tap, tap, tap of fingers against the window, reminding him that some places are never truly empty. Jenna, Nick, and Taylor had heard the rumors about Silent Pines Forest for years. It was the kind of place people whispered about, especially around campfires during summer nights. Local legend said that the forest was cursed, a place where people disappeared without a trace. Some said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had ventured too far inside, while others claimed that something far darker was lurking in the depths of the woods. But for the three friends, it was the perfect spot for an adventure. Jenna had suggested the trip. It'll be fun, she'd said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. We'll go for a hike, camp out for the night, and maybe we'll even catch a glimpse of the famous Silent Pines ghost. Nick wasn't so sure. He'd heard enough stories about the forest to know that something was off about it, but he didn't want to be the one to back out. Taylor, on the other hand, was all in. What's the worst that could happen? She'd laughed. We'll come back with some awesome stories. So they packed up their gear, sleeping bags, tents, food, and flashlights and set off for Silent Pines on a cool autumn afternoon. The forest was only a few hours away from the city, tucked away in a remote part of the countryside. As they drove, the trees seemed to grow denser, their towering trunks casting long shadows over the narrow road. Jenna, who was driving, glanced at Nick in the passenger seat. "You still scared?" Nick rolled his eyes. "I'm not scared. I just don't see the point of spending the night in a haunted forest." "Exactly why we're doing it," Taylor said from the back seat, grinning. "It's going to be epic." They arrived at the entrance to the forest just as the sun began to set. Silent Pines was even more isolated than they had expected. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just a single dirt trail winding into the trees. "This is it," Jenna said, pulling the car to a stop. The silence that followed was unsettling. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, oppressive quiet. Nick stepped out of the car, adjusting his backpack. "All right, let's get this over with." The three of them started down the trail, their footsteps crunching on the fallen leaves. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the light began to fade, and a heavy mist rolled in, clinging to the trees and making it harder to see. The trail narrowed, and soon it felt as though the forest was closing in around them. Taylor, always the optimist, tried to keep the mood light. "So what's the story again? A bunch of hikers went missing here, right?" Jenna nodded, glancing at her phone. "Yeah, supposedly they got lost and never came back. But there's a legend about the forest being cursed, something about an ancient spirit that haunts these woods." Nick shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around him. "I don't believe in ghosts, but this place definitely feels wrong." They continued walking in silence for a while, the mist growing thicker with every step. The trees were so tall and tightly packed that they blocked out most of the remaining light, casting everything in an eerie twilight. Jenna checked her phone again, no signal. "Typical," she muttered. "We're officially off the grid." As the trail began to disappear beneath the mist, Jenna, Nick, and Taylor stopped to set up camp. They found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and began unpacking their gear. The air was damp and cold, and the silence was almost suffocating. "This place is creepy as hell," Nick muttered as he unrolled his sleeping bag. "I mean, listen to how quiet it is. No animals, no wind. It's like the forest is dead." Taylor, ever the brave one, laughed. "It's just a forest, Nick." Don't let your imagination get the best of you. But even Jenna, who had been the most enthusiastic about the trip, was starting to feel uneasy. There was something about the stillness of the forest that made her skin crawl. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something watching them from the shadows. After they set up their tents, they built a small fire and sat around it, trying to shake off the growing tension. The flames flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the clearing. Jenna couldn't stop herself from staring into the trees, her mind playing tricks on her as the mist swirled between the trunks. So Taylor said, grinning, "Anyone up for some ghost stories?" Nick groaned. "Please no. This place is creepy enough as it is." But Taylor wasn't going to let him off that easily. "Come on, it's tradition. We're in a haunted forest, it's practically mandatory." Jenna shrugged, forcing a smile. "Why not? We're already here." Taylor launched into a story about a haunted house in the city, one that she claimed had been cursed for over 100 years. But as she spoke, Jenna found herself tuning out, her attention drawn to the darkness beyond the firelight. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, shifting and swirling like something was out there, hiding just out of sight. Halfway through the story, Jenna froze. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, cutting Taylor off mid-sentence. Nick and Taylor stopped talking, their eyes wide as they listened. At first, there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the sound of their own breathing. But then, faintly, they heard it, a soft, rhythmic rustling, like something moving through the underbrush. Nick stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "What the hell is that?" The rustling grew louder, coming closer. Jenna grabbed her flashlight and shone it into the trees, but the beam barely penetrated the thick mist. The forest beyond the clearing was a wall of shadows, impenetrable and dark. "Maybe it's just an animal," Taylor said, though her voice wavered. But Jenna wasn't so sure. The sound was too deliberate, too steady. It wasn't the random rustling of a deer or a rabbit, it was footsteps. Someone or something was out there. "We should go," Nick said, his voice shaking. "This place isn't right." Before anyone could argue, the rustling stopped. Silence. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she scanned the tree line, her flashlight darting back and forth. The mist swirled around the trees, thickening, until it seemed like the darkness itself was closing in on them. And then from the shadows they heard it. A low, guttural voice, barely more than a whisper. It sounded like it was coming from everywhere at once, surrounding them, seeping out of the mist. "You shouldn't be here." Taylor jumped to her feet, her face pale. What the hell was that? No one answered. They didn't need to. Jenna's heart raced as she fumbled with her backpack, grabbing her gear. "We need to leave. Now." The three of them scrambled to pack up their things, their hands shaking as they shoved their belongings into their bags. The voice came again, closer this time. "Leave, while you still can." Jenna's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she pulled on her backpack. The voice was right there, just beyond the firelight. She could feel it, pressing in on them from all sides. They didn't wait to see what was out there. With their hearts pounding, they grabbed their bags and ran, leaving the campfire behind as they fled down the trail. The mist was so thick now that they could barely see more than a few feet in front of them. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees stretching out like long, bony fingers. As they ran, the voice followed them, growing louder, more insistent. "Run, run." Jenna stumbled, her flashlight flickering as she pushed herself to go faster. The ground was uneven, and the mist made it hard to see, but she didn't care. She couldn't stop, not now. Not when she could feel the presence behind her, watching her, chasing her. Taylor screamed, and Jenna whipped around just in time to see her fall. Nick rushed to help her, but before they could get her back on her feet, the mist seemed to thicken, swallowing them up. Jenna screamed their names, but her voice was lost in the fog. She was alone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she ran, tears streaming down her face. The voice was still there, whispering, taunting. "You can't escape." Jenna's legs burned with exhaustion, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to find a way out. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run any further, she saw a faint light in the distance. Her breath caught in her throat as she stumbled toward it, hope blooming in her chest. But as she drew closer, her heart sank. It wasn't the way out. It was the campfire. The same campfire they had left behind. Jenna's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the ground, her chest heaving as the truth washed over her. They hadn't escaped. They were trapped. And whatever haunted Silent Pines wasn't going to let them leave. Just like Jenna and her friends couldn't escape the horrors of Silent Pines, you won't want to miss the spine-chilling stories we have coming your way. Subscribe now to stay up to date with the latest terrifying tales and explore the darkest corners of horror with us. Don't let these stories disappear into the mist. Subscribe and never miss a fright. The legend of the Mirror Man was one that had haunted the small town of Millwood for decades. People spoke of it in hushed tones, passing the tale down through generations as a warning, especially to the younger kids who thought they were invincible. The story went that if you said his name 5 times in front of a mirror, the Mirror Man would appear first as a shadow in the reflection, then slowly taking form until he stood behind you, ready to claim another soul. For most people, it was nothing more than a ghost story. But for Alex, Chris, and Megan, it was an irresistible challenge. The 3 friends had been inseparable since childhood, always daring each other to do things that were reckless and often terrifying. But this was different. They weren't kids anymore, and the stakes felt higher. Still, Alex, ever the instigator, was determined to see if the legend was true. It was a stormy Friday night when they finally decided to give it a go. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded against the windows of Chris's house. His parents were away for the weekend, leaving them alone with their excitement and nerves. They sat around the coffee table in the living room, the dim glow of a single candle flickering in the center. "Are we really doing this?" Megan asked, her voice wavering slightly as she glanced at the large mirror hanging on the wall. Alex smirked. "Of course we are. What's the worst that could happen? It's just a stupid story." Chris wasn't so sure. "I don't know, man. People say weird things have happened after they tried it." Alex rolled his eyes. "Come on. It's just an urban legend. Nothing's going to happen." Megan bit her lip, her gaze flicking between her friends in the mirror. She didn't want to back out, but the idea of summoning some kind of spirit wasn't exactly her idea of a fun Friday night. Still, she knew if she refused, Alex would never let her hear the end of it. "All we have to do is say his name 5 times, right?" Chris asked, trying to sound nonchalant, though the tightness in his voice gave him away. Alex nodded. "Yeah, just say Mirror Man 5 times, and he's supposed to appear. Easy." They stood up, moving toward the mirror. The room seemed to grow colder as they approached it, and Megan wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling as though the storm outside had slipped into the house. The candlelight flickered more violently, casting strange shadows on the walls. The air felt thick, heavy with anticipation. Alex stood directly in front of the mirror, his reflection staring back at him. He could see Chris and Megan standing a few feet behind him, their faces pale and tense. "Well," Alex said, his voice filled with false bravado, "here goes nothing." He stared into the mirror and, without hesitation, said the words "Mirror Man." "Mirror Man, Mirror Man, Mirror man, mirror man. He paused, his heart racing. The fifth and final repetition hung in the air, almost daring him to say it. Mirror man. For a moment, nothing happened. They all stood there, staring at their reflections in the mirror, waiting for anything to happen. The storm raged outside, the wind howling and rattling the windows, but inside the room, there was only silence. Megan let out a nervous laugh. "See, I told you." But then the lights flickered. They all froze, staring at the mirror. The reflections remained unchanged, but something was wrong. The room felt darker now, as though the shadows had crept closer. The temperature had dropped even more, and Megan could see her breath in the air. Alex swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. "It's just the storm," he said, though his voice shook slightly. Powers probably flickering because of the wind. But Megan wasn't convinced. Her eyes remained glued to the mirror, and that's when she saw it. At first, it was barely noticeable, a faint shadow in the corner of the mirror, just behind Alex's reflection. She blinked, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the shadow remained. It grew darker, taking shape. "Alex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's behind you." Alex's stomach dropped, but he forced a laugh. "Yeah, right. Nice try, Megan." "I'm serious," she said, her voice rising in panic. "Look." Chris stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he peered into the mirror. His breath caught in his throat. "Dude, she's not joking. There's something in the mirror." Alex's heart pounded in his chest as he turned to look over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. The room behind him was empty, just the dark shadows cast by the candlelight. He turned back to the mirror, his hands trembling now. That's when he saw it. The shadow had solidified into a figure, a tall, gaunt man, his face obscured by darkness. He stood behind Alex's reflection, his long, bony fingers reaching out toward him. Alex stumbled backward, his eyes wide with terror. "What the hell is that?" Chris grabbed Megan's arm, pulling her back as they all stared at the figure in the mirror. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his eyes two black pits of nothingness locked onto Alex's reflection. His mouth was twisted into a cruel smile. "We need to get out of here," Megan whispered, her voice shaking as tears welled in her eyes. Chris nodded, but before they could move, the mirror shattered. The sound was deafening, like 1,000 pieces of glass exploding all at once. The room was plunged into darkness as the candle blew out, and for a moment there was only silence, complete, suffocating silence. Then, from the darkness, came a low, rasping voice. "You called." Megan screamed, stumbling backward into Chris as they both scrambled for the door. Alex, frozen in place, could barely breathe. His mind raced, his body refusing to move as the figure in the mirror began to take form in the real world. The man stepped out of the broken shards, his long limbs unfolding unnaturally, his bony fingers stretching toward Alex. "Alex." "Come on," Chris shouted, grabbing his friend's arm and yanking him toward the door. They burst out of the room, the darkness pressing in around them as they ran down the hallway, their footsteps echoing through the house. The sound of the storm outside was drowned out by the pounding of their hearts, the adrenaline surging through their veins. Behind them, they could hear it, the slow, deliberate footsteps of the mirror man, following them. His voice whispered through the air, cold and chilling. "You can't run." They tore down the stairs, barely able to see in the pitch-black house. Chris fumbled with the front door, his hands shaking as he tried to unlock it. "Hurry, hurry," Megan cried, her voice breaking with fear. Finally, the door swung open, and they stumbled outside into the storm. The wind and rain hit them like a wall, but they didn't stop. They sprinted toward the car, not daring to look back. Chris fumbled with the keys, his hands slick with rain as he struggled to unlock the car. The rain pounded against the roof, and the wind howled through the trees, but nothing drowned out the sound of the footsteps getting closer. "Hurry," Alex yelled, glancing over his shoulder. Chris finally managed to unlock the car, and they all piled in, slamming the doors shut behind them. He jammed the key into the ignition, his hands trembling as he turned it. The engine sputtered once, twice, and then roared to life. Without a second thought, Chris floored the gas, and the car lurched forward, speeding down the rain-soaked street. The headlights cut through the storm, but the darkness behind them seemed to chase after them, as if the Mirror Man wasn't done. As they drove, their breaths came in ragged gasps, their minds racing. None of them spoke. They couldn't. The reality of what had just happened was too much to process. It wasn't until they were miles away, the storm finally beginning to let up, that Megan broke the silence. "What? What was that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Alex shook his head, his hands still gripping the edge of his seat. "I don't know, but we're never going back there." Chris nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Never. The three friends drove in silence, the distant lights of the town growing closer. But even as they left the house and the Mirror Man behind, none of them could shake the feeling that they were still being watched. The legend wasn't just a story anymore. And somewhere, in the shattered remains of that mirror, the Mirror Man was waiting for the next group of daring souls to call his name. There were plenty of hiking trails in the mountains around Black Hollow, but none as notorious as the Black Hollow Ridge Trail. It wasn't the steep incline or the rugged terrain that made the trail famous, it was what people claimed they saw after dark. Those who had braved the hike at night spoke of eerie figures, known as the Night Walkers, shadowy beings that roamed the trail after sunset. The stories varied. Some said the Night Walkers were ghosts of long-lost hikers forever wandering the woods. Others claimed they were something darker, creatures that had never been human to begin with. Whatever they were, the rule was simple: if you saw them, you had to leave immediately before they saw you die. Of course, to a group of 20-somethings like Tom, Jasmine, and Ben, this was exactly the kind of thrill they were looking for. A haunted hike sounded like the perfect way to spend a weekend, at least it did after a few drinks at the local bar. The three friends had planned a camping trip near the ridge for months, but when they heard the legend of the Night Walkers from a bartender, they knew they had to experience the trail at night. "Come on, you don't seriously believe that crap, do you?" Tom had said, laughing as he downed the last of his beer. "It's just a story people tell to keep tourists away." Jasmine wasn't so sure. "People said they've seen them," she replied, her voice more cautious. The bartender seemed convinced. Ben shrugged. "Who cares? It's probably some prank or something. Either way, it'll be fun. Besides, we'll have a story to tell when we're done." And that was it. Their minds were made up. The next evening, they set off for the ridge. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the forest as they made their way up the narrow trail. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine filled their lungs as they hiked higher, the world below growing smaller with each step. It was quiet, eerily so. The usual sounds of birds, rustling leaves, and scurrying animals were absent, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Jasmine was the first to voice her discomfort. "Is it just me, or does this place feel off?" Ben chuckled, trying to lighten the mood. "Come on, we're just psyching ourselves out. It's probably the elevation getting to you." But Tom wasn't laughing. He glanced at the darkening sky, his footsteps slowing. "Maybe we should head back soon," he said, his voice betraying a hint of unease. "I don't like the idea of being out here after dark." Jasmine raised an eyebrow. What happened to you not believing in the night walkers? I don't, Tom replied quickly. I don't know. It feels different out here. They continued hiking in silence, the path winding higher into the woods. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the ridge, the trail was plunged into shadow. Their flashlights flickered to life, casting long, shaky beams ahead of them. Let's just go a little further, Ben said, though even his voice had lost some of its confidence. We've come this far. Jasmine shot him a look but didn't argue. They pressed on, the trees closing in around them, their branches casting strange, twisted shadows on the ground. The trail became narrower, more overgrown, as though it hadn't been used in years. And that's when they heard it. A soft, distant sound like the crunch of leaves underfoot. At first it was so faint they thought they were imagining it, but it grew louder with each step, coming from somewhere behind them. Tom stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. Did you hear that? Jasmine and Ben nodded, their faces pale in the dim light. The crunching sound was unmistakable now, slow and deliberate, as if someone or something was following them. But when they turned to look, the trail behind them was empty. Ben laughed nervously. Okay, very funny. Who's trying to scare us? But no one answered. The forest was silent again, save for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Let's just keep moving, Jasmine whispered, her grip tightening on her flashlight. It's probably just an animal. They continued up the trail, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing minute. The air seemed heavier, thicker, as though the forest itself was closing in on them. And then, out of the corner of her eye, Jasmine saw it a shadow, barely visible between the trees. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its movements too slow. She blinked, thinking it was her imagination, but when she looked again, it was still there, gliding silently through the trees. Her breath caught in her throat. Tom. Ben, she whispered, her voice trembling. There's something out there. Tom turned, his eyes widening as he caught sight of the shadowy figure. What the hell is that? Before anyone could answer, more figures appeared, 3, 4, 5 of them, all moving slowly, their dark forms blending with the trees. They were the night walkers. Ben stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. We need to go. Now. Panic surged through them as they turned and bolted down the trail, their footsteps pounding against the dirt. The night walkers didn't give chase, but their presence loomed, a terrifying reminder that the legend was all too real. The trail seemed longer on the way down, the trees pressing in closer, the darkness thicker. Their flashlights flickered and sputtered, the beams barely cutting through the mist that had begun to roll in from the valley below. Don't look back, Tom shouted, his voice filled with terror. Just keep going. But Jasmine couldn't help herself. She glanced over her shoulder, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The night walkers were following them. They didn't run. They didn't need to. They simply moved, slowly, steadily, their figures gliding through the trees like shadows. And as they drew closer, Jasmine could make out their faces gaunt, hollow, and featureless. Their eyes were nothing more than empty voids, and their mouths twisted into grotesque, gaping smiles. Her legs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The trail twisted and turned, and soon she lost sight of Tom and Ben, their figures swallowed by the darkness ahead. The trees seemed to blur together, the ground shifting beneath her feet, as if the forest itself was alive. And then, just as she thought she couldn't run any further, she saw the faint glow of the trailhead in the distance. Relief flooded her, and she sprinted toward it, her legs trembling with exhaustion. But the night walkers were still behind her, their cold presence pressing in closer with each step. Jasmine burst out of the forest and into the parking lot, her chest heaving as she collapsed against the side of the car. Tom and Ben were already there, their faces pale and drenched in sweat. "Did they follow you?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. Jasmine shook her head, gasping for breath. I don't know." The three of them stared at the edge of the forest, waiting, their hearts pounding. But the night walkers didn't appear. The trail remained silent, the trees swaying gently in the breeze, as if nothing had happened. For a moment they sat there in stunned silence, the weight of what they had just experienced sinking in. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. Finally, Ben broke the silence. "We're never doing that again." Tom and Jasmine nodded in agreement, their hands still shaking. They climbed into the car, their bodies exhausted, their minds racing with thoughts of the shadows they had seen. As they drove away, leaving Black Hollow Ridge behind, none of them could shake the feeling that the night walkers were still watching them from the trees. And in the quiet moments of the drive, when the sound of the engine faded into the background and the world outside seemed too still, Jasmine could have sworn she heard the soft crunch of leaves behind them, slow, steady footsteps, following them down the mountain. Just like Tom, Jasmine, and Ben barely escaped the night walkers of Black Hollow, you don't want to miss the terrifying stories we have coming your way. Subscribe now to our channel to stay up to date with the latest haunting tales and urban legends that will send chills down your spine. Don't wait until the night walkers catch up to you. Subscribe today. Every small town has its legends, but none were as terrifying as the one whispered around the campfires in Maple Creek. Locals knew it simply as the Woodsman. The story was always the same. He was a towering figure, clad in tattered clothes and wielding a rusted axe, cursed to roam the woods at night, hunting those foolish enough to trespass on his land. Some said he had been a man once, a logger who had met a grisly fate at the hands of his own crew. Others claimed he was never human at all, a vengeful spirit that preyed on the living. To the teenagers of Maple Creek, the story was nothing more than a scary tale to spook each other with on summer nights. But for Ethan, Sarah, and Logan, it was a challenge. They'd grown up hearing the legend and had laughed it off as just another ghost story. So when Logan suggested they spend the weekend camping near the woods where the Woodsman was said to roam, Ethan and Sarah had eagerly agreed. "What's the worst that could happen?" Ethan had said, grinning as they packed their gear into the trunk of his car. "It's just a story. We'll tell everyone at school how we camped out and survived the weekend without seeing a single creepy axe murderer." Logan had chuckled, his hands gripping the straps of his backpack. "Exactly. Besides, think of the stories we'll have to tell when we get back." Sarah, the more cautious of the group, hadn't been so sure. "I don't know, guys. My grandpa always said there was something strange about those woods. People have disappeared there, and not just a long time ago, like recently." But Ethan and Logan had waved off her concerns. After all, it was just a story, or so they thought. The three friends set off on a Friday afternoon, the sun high in the sky as they drove deeper into the countryside. Maple Creek was surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills, and the further they drove, the more isolated they became. The houses grew fewer, replaced by thick clusters of trees that towered over the narrow dirt road. Soon, they were completely surrounded by forest. "This is it," Logan said, pulling out the map they'd printed. "We're close to the spot." They arrived at the campsite late in the afternoon, a small clearing tucked away at the edge of the woods. It was the perfect place, quiet, secluded, and surrounded by tall pines that stretched endlessly into the sky. They set up their tents, gathered firewood, and settled in for what they thought would be an uneventful night. The first few hours were peaceful. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned a deep orange, fading into purple as night crept in. The campfire crackled, sending sparks into the air, as the three friends sat around it, laughing and telling stories. Ethan, always the storyteller, was in the middle of recounting an exaggerated tale of their high school misadventures when Sarah interrupted. "Shay," she hissed, her eyes darting toward the woods. "Did you hear that?" Ethan paused, his smile fading as he listened. At first there was nothing but the crackling of the fire and the distant rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, faintly, he heard it too, a soft, rhythmic thudding sound, like footsteps coming from somewhere deep in the forest. Logan shrugged, tossing another log onto the fire. "It's probably just a deer or something. These woods are full of animals." But Sarah wasn't convinced. She leaned forward, her face illuminated by the flickering flames. "That didn't sound like an animal," she whispered. "It sounded human." Ethan chuckled, trying to shake off the growing unease that settled over the camp. "Come on, Sarah. Don't get all freaked out on us now. We haven't even started telling the scary stories yet." But the tension in the air was palpable. The sun had fully set, and the forest around them had grown darker, the trees casting long, eerie shadows. The moon, hidden behind a layer of clouds, offered little light, and the woods seemed to stretch on forever, an endless sea of black. "All right," Logan said, standing up and stretching. "If we're going to be scared all night, we might as well make it worth it. Who wants to hear the story of the woodsman?" Ethan and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances. They'd heard the story a million times, but something about hearing it out here, so close to the woods where the legend began, felt different. Still, Ethan nodded, trying to maintain his bravado. "Yeah, sure, why not?" Logan grinned, sitting back down and leaning closer to the fire. His face was cast in shadow, his eyes gleaming in the firelight. It all started over 100 years ago, when Maple Creek was just a small logging town. As Logan spun the familiar tale, Ethan found his mind drifting. He stared into the flickering flames, watching as the firelight danced on the surrounding trees. The thudding sound had stopped, but the forest felt too still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. "And they say," Logan continued, his voice low and dramatic, "if you hear footsteps in the woods at night, it means the woodsman is near. He's watching you, waiting for you to wander too far from the campfire. And if you see him, it's already too late." The wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead. Sarah shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Okay, that's enough," she said, her voice shaky. "We get it. It's just a story." But Logan wasn't finished. "The woodsman doesn't like trespassers," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "He's out there, wandering the woods, searching for anyone foolish enough to come into his territory. And if you're not careful, he'll find you." Just as Logan finished speaking, a loud snap echoed through the trees. All three of them jumped, their heads whipping toward the sound. It was close, too close, like a branch breaking under the weight of something heavy. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he grabbed the flashlight from his backpack, flicking it on and shining it toward the edge of the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees. For a moment, everything was still. And then they saw it. A figure, barely visible between the trees, stood at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, its outline ragged and hunched, like a man, but wrong. Its clothes hung in tatters, and in its hand, it held something long and gleaming in the moonlight, a rusted axe. Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Ethan, is that?" Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It can't be. But there was no mistaking it. The figure was exactly as the legend described. The woodsman. Before any of them could move, the figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, the crunch of leaves underfoot breaking the tense silence. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows as the figure moved closer. "Run," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "We have to run." Logan didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his bag and bolted toward the trail, his footsteps pounding against the dirt. Sarah followed close behind, her breath coming in panicked gasps as she glanced over her shoulder. Ethan was right behind them, his flashlight bobbing wildly as they fled into the woods. The darkness was disorienting, the trees blurring together as they ran, their footsteps echoing in the still night. Ethan's mind raced, his heart pounding as he tried to remember the way back to the car. But the trail was narrow, overgrown, and it was easy to lose track of where they were going. Behind them, they could hear the steady, deliberate footsteps of the woodsman, following them through the trees. "He's still coming," Sarah cried, her voice filled with terror. Ethan's lungs burned, his legs aching as he pushed himself to run faster. The trail twisted and turned, the forest closing in around them, but there was no escape. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and Ethan could feel the presence of the woodsman just behind him, as if the air itself had turned cold and oppressive. Suddenly, Logan tripped, his foot catching on a root, and he tumbled to the ground with a shout. Ethan skidded to a stop, turning to help his friend, but the look on Logan's face stopped him cold. Logan's eyes were wide with horror as he stared past Ethan, his voice trembling. "He's right behind you." Ethan turned, his breath catching in his throat. The woodsman stood just a few feet away, his gaunt figure towering over them. His face was hidden in shadow, but the glint of his rusted axe shone in the moonlight, raised high above his head. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, Ethan grabbed Logan's arm and yanked him to his feet. "Run," he shouted, his voice breaking with fear. They sprinted down the trail, their legs burning, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The footsteps of the woodsman echoed behind them, relentless and steady, but they didn't dare look back. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they burst out of the woods and into the small parking lot where their car was parked. They scrambled inside, slamming the doors shut as Ethan fumbled with the keys. His hands shook as he jammed the key into the ignition, and the car roared to life. Without looking back, they sped down the dirt road, leaving the woods and the woodsman behind. For a long time, none of them spoke. The adrenaline was still pumping through their veins, their minds racing with what they had just experienced. Finally, Sarah broke the silence, her voice shaky. "What the hell was that?" Ethan shook his head, his hands still trembling on the steering wheel. "I don't know, but we're never coming back here again." Logan, pale and wide-eyed, nodded in agreement. "Never." As they drove away, the dark silhouette of the woods loomed in the rearview mirror, but none of them dared to look back. The legend of the woodsman was no longer just a story. It was real. The legend of the crying girl of Hollow Creek was one that had been passed down in the small town of Bridgeton for as long as anyone could remember. It was one of those stories everyone grew up with, the kind that teenagers used to scare each other late at night, daring their friends to venture down to the creek where the ghost was said to appear. But no one ever really believed it, at least, not until someone claimed they had seen her for themselves. According to the legend, the crying girl had once been a young woman named Eliza, who had lived near Hollow Creek more than a century ago. Her fiancé had drowned in the creek on the eve of their wedding, swept away by the current after a heavy rainstorm. Heartbroken, Eliza was said to have thrown herself into the water in despair, her spirit forever bound to the creek, where she could be heard weeping for her lost love on stormy nights. The story fascinated Beth, Ryan, and Lily, who had grown up in Bridgeton hearing the tale. As they got older, the three friends became less afraid of the story and more curious. One rainy weekend, while sitting in Beth's living room with nothing to do, they decided to see if the legend was real. "Why not?" Beth had said, staring out the window as rain drummed against the glass. It's just a story. We've got nothing else going on. Let's go check it out. Ryan had shrugged, always up for an adventure, but Lily hesitated. She had always been more sensitive to things like this, and the thought of confronting a ghost real or not made her stomach twist in knots. I don't know, guys, Lily said, biting her lip. What if there really is something down there? My mom always said she heard crying when she was a kid. She never went back. Beth rolled her eyes. Come on, Lily. You don't really believe that, do you? We've all heard the story, but no one's actually seen anything. It's just an old wives' tale. Ryan, sensing Lily's hesitation, chimed in. Look, if we get down there and it's creepy, we'll leave. No big deal. But wouldn't it be cool if we actually saw something? Reluctantly, Lily agreed, and the three friends grabbed their rain jackets, flashlights, and backpacks, heading out into the rainy afternoon. Hollow Creek wasn't far, a 20-minute walk through the woods at the edge of town, winding down a narrow path until you reached the small wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The rain hadn't let up by the time they arrived at the trailhead. The woods were dark and damp, the smell of wet leaves and pine filling the air. Lily pulled her jacket tighter around her, already regretting her decision to come. Okay, so what's the plan? Ryan asked, shining his flashlight down the muddy path that led to the creek. We go to the bridge, wait for a while, and see if anything happens, Beth said confidently. If we don't hear anything after a few minutes, we head back. Simple. Lily nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly as she adjusted the strap of her backpack. The path was slick with mud, making their progress slow as they trudged through the trees. The rain pounded against the leaves overhead, but the dense canopy provided some shelter, muting the sound of the storm. As they walked, the woods around them seemed to close in, the trees growing taller and thicker the deeper they went. The trail became narrower, and soon the only sounds were the squelching of their boots in the mud and the steady drip of rainwater from the branches. This place is seriously creepy, Ryan muttered, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. I don't remember it being this dark. Beth glanced back at him. It's just the rain. Everything looks creepier in the rain. But even Beth's bravado was fading as they approached the creek. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest birds, insects, rustling leaves were conspicuously absent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Finally, they reached the bridge. The creek was swollen with rainwater, the current rushing beneath the old wooden planks. The bridge itself was narrow and rickety, sagging in the middle as if it had been neglected for years. A thin mist clung to the surface of the water, swirling around the bridge like tendrils of fog. This is what Beth said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She glanced around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Now we just wait. They stood in silence for several minutes, the rain continuing to fall in a steady downpour. The creek gurgled softly, the sound of the rushing water mixing with the patter of raindrops. For a while, nothing happened. Lily shifted uneasily, her eyes fixed on the creek below. She had expected to feel scared, but what she felt instead was an overwhelming sadness, like the weight of something ancient and sorrowful pressing down on her chest. And then, faintly, she heard it. A soft, distant sobbing, barely audible over the rain. Did you hear that? Lily whispered, her heart racing. Ryan and Beth exchanged nervous glances, but neither of them had heard anything. Hear what Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I think I heard her, Lily said, her voice trembling. The crying. Beth frowned, straining her ears to listen. I don't hear anything. Are you sure? Lily nodded, her eyes wide. The sound was growing louder now, unmistakable, a soft, mournful weeping, carried on the wind. Suddenly, the atmosphere around them changed. The air grew colder, and the mist swirling over the creek thickened, rising up from the water like smoke. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking under the weight of the rain. The sobbing grew louder, more distinct, and now they could all hear its soft, anguished cries echoing through the woods. "That's it," Ryan said, his voice tight with fear. "We need to go." Beth, who had been the most eager to prove the legend false, was now pale and wide-eyed, her bravado gone. "Yeah, let's get out of here." They turned to leave, but as they stepped onto the trail, the crying stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence, complete and utter silence, as though the world itself had paused. Even the rain seemed to quiet, the drops falling in slow motion around them. And then they saw her. A figure standing at the edge of the creek, just beneath the bridge. She was barely visible through the mist, her pale form shrouded in white, her long, dark hair hanging in wet strands around her face. She stood still, her back to them, her head bowed as if she were looking into the water below. "Oh my God," Beth whispered, her voice trembling. "It's her." Lily's breath caught in her throat. The sadness she had felt earlier returned, stronger now, overwhelming her senses. She could feel the weight of Eliza's sorrow, as though it were her own. The figure didn't move. She simply stood there, her shoulders shaking as if she were still crying, though no sound came from her anymore. "We have to leave," Ryan whispered urgently. "Now." But before they could move, the figure began to turn. Slowly, her head lifted, and she turned to face them, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were underwater. As her face came into view, Lily's heart stopped. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids where her eyes should have been. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth was twisted into a sorrowful, broken smile. Lily's legs felt like lead as she stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "We need to go," she whispered, her voice shaking with terror. "Now." Without another word, they turned and ran, their footsteps splashing through the mud as they fled back down the trail. The sound of the creek faded behind them, but the image of the crying girl was burned into their minds, her hollow eyes and sorrowful smile haunting their every step. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath as they burst out onto the road. The rain had lessened, the storm beginning to pass, but the terror of what they had seen clung to them like a shadow. For a long time, none of them spoke. The reality of what they had just witnessed was too much to process. Finally, Beth broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. "We actually saw her." Ryan nodded, his face pale and drawn. "Yeah, we did." Lily, still trembling, wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't think it was just a story after all." They never spoke of the crying girl again after that night. But for years afterward, whenever it rained, Lily would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, her heart pounding in her chest. And in the distance, just beyond the sound of the falling rain, she would hear the soft, mournful sobs of the crying girl of Hollow Creek, weeping for the love she had lost. The legend of the crying girl of Hollow Creek was one that had been passed down in the small town of Bridgeton for as long as anyone could remember. It was one of those stories everyone grew up with, the kind that teenagers used to scare each other late at night, daring their friends to venture down to the creek where the ghost was said to appear. But no one ever really believed it, at least, not until someone claimed they had seen her for themselves. According to the legend, the crying girl had once been a young woman named Eliza, who had lived near Hollow Creek more than a century ago. Her fiancé had drowned in the creek on the eve of their wedding, swept away by the current after a heavy rainstorm. Heartbroken, Eliza was said to have thrown herself into the water in despair, her spirit forever bound to the creek, where she could be heard weeping for her lost love on stormy nights. The story fascinated Beth, Ryan, and Lily, who had grown up in Bridget hearing the tale. As they got older, the three friends became less afraid of the story and more curious. One rainy weekend, while sitting in Beth's living room with nothing to do, they decided to see if the legend was real. Why not, Beth had said, staring out the window as rain drummed against the glass. It's just a story. We've got nothing else going on. Let's go check it out. Ryan had shrugged, always up for an adventure, but Lily hesitated. She had always been more sensitive to things like this, and the thought of confronting a ghost real or not made her stomach twist in knots. I don't know, guys, Lily said, biting her lip. What if there really is something down there? My mom always said she heard crying when she was a kid. She never went back. Beth rolled her eyes. Come on, Lily. You don't really believe that, do you? We've all heard the story, but no one's actually seen anything. It's just an old wives' tale. Ryan, sensing Lily's hesitation, chimed in. Look, if we get down there and it's creepy, we'll leave. No big deal. But wouldn't it be cool if we actually saw something? Reluctantly, Lily agreed, and the three friends grabbed their rain jackets, flashlights, and backpacks, heading out into the rainy afternoon. Hollow Creek wasn't far, a 20-minute walk through the woods at the edge of town, winding down a narrow path until you reached the small wooden bridge that crossed the creek. The rain hadn't let up by the time they arrived at the trailhead. The woods were dark and damp, the smell of wet leaves and pine filling the air. Lily pulled her jacket tighter around her, already regretting her decision to come. Okay, so what's the plan? Ryan asked, shining his flashlight down the muddy path that led to the creek. We go to the bridge, wait for a while, and see if anything happens, Beth said confidently. If we don't hear anything after a few minutes, we head back. Simple. Lily nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly as she adjusted the strap of her backpack. The path was slick with mud, making their progress slow as they trudged through the trees. The rain pounded against the leaves overhead, but the dense canopy provided some shelter, muting the sound of the storm. As they walked, the woods around them seemed to close in, the trees growing taller and thicker the deeper they went. The trail became narrower, and soon the only sounds were the squelching of their boots in the mud and the steady drip of rainwater from the branches. This place is seriously creepy, Ryan muttered, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. I don't remember it being this dark. Beth glanced back at him. It's just the rain. Everything looks creepier in the rain. But even Beth's bravado was fading as they approached the creek. The air had grown colder, and the usual sounds of the forest birds, insects, rustling leaves were conspicuously absent. It was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Finally, they reached the bridge. The creek was swollen with rainwater, the current rushing beneath the old wooden planks. The bridge itself was narrow and rickety, sagging in the middle as if it had been neglected for years. A thin mist clung to the surface of the water, swirling around the bridge like tendrils of fog. This is it, Beth said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. She glanced around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Now we just wait. They stood in silence for several minutes, the rain continuing to fall in a steady downpour. The creek gurgled softly, the sound of the rushing water mixing with the patter of raindrops. For a while, nothing happened. Lily shifted uneasily, her eyes fixed on the creek below. She had expected to feel scared, but what she felt instead was an overwhelming sadness, like the weight of something ancient and sorrowful pressing down on her chest. And then, faintly, she heard it. A soft, distant sobbing, barely audible over the rain. Did you hear that? Lily whispered, her heart racing. Ryan and Beth exchanged nervous glances, but neither of them had heard anything. Hear what Ryan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Aye. I think I heard her, Lily said, her voice trembling. The crying. Beth frowned, straining her ears to listen. I don't hear anything. Are you sure? Lily nodded, her eyes wide. The sound was growing louder now, unmistakable, a soft, mournful weeping, carried on the wind. Suddenly, the atmosphere around them changed. The air grew colder, and the mist swirling over the creek thickened, rising up from the water like smoke. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking under the weight of the rain. The sobbing grew louder, more distinct, and now they could all hear its soft, anguished cries echoing through the woods. That's it, Ryan said, his voice tight with fear. We need to go. Beth, who had been the most eager to prove the legend false, was now pale and wide-eyed, her bravado gone. Yeah, let's get out of here. They turned to leave, but as they stepped onto the trail, the crying stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was silence, complete and utter silence, as though the world itself had paused. Even the rain seemed to quiet, the drops falling in slow motion around them. And then they saw her. A figure, standing at the edge of the creek, just beneath the bridge. She was barely visible through the mist, her pale form shrouded in white, her long, dark hair hanging in wet strands around her face. She stood still, her back to them, her head bowed as if she were looking into the water below. Oh my God, Beth whispered, her voice trembling. It's her. Lily's breath caught in her throat. The sadness she had felt earlier returned, stronger now, overwhelming her senses. She could feel the weight of Eliza's sorrow, as though it were her own. The figure didn't move. She simply stood there, her shoulders shaking as if she were still crying, though no sound came from her anymore. We have to leave, Ryan whispered urgently. Now. But before they could move, the figure began to turn. Slowly her head lifted, and she turned to face them, her movement slow and deliberate, as though she were underwater. As her face came into view, Lily's heart stopped. Her eyes were hollow, dark voids where her eyes should have been. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her mouth was twisted into a sorrowful, broken smile. Lily's legs felt like lead as she stumbled backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. We need to go, she whispered, her voice shaking with terror. Now. Without another word, they turned and ran, their footsteps splashing through the mud as they fled back down the trail. The sound of the creek faded behind them, but the image of the crying girl was burned into their minds, her hollow eyes and sorrowful smile haunting their every step. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the woods, gasping for breath as they burst out onto the road. The rain had lessened, the storm beginning to pass, but the terror of what they had seen clung to them like a shadow. For a long time, none of them spoke. The reality of what they had just witnessed was too much to process. Finally, Beth broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. We actually saw her. Ryan nodded, his face pale and drawn. Yeah, we did. Lily, still trembling, wiped a tear from her cheek. I don't think it was just a story after all. They never spoke of the crying girl again after that night. But for years afterward, whenever it rained, Lily would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, her heart pounding in her chest. And in the distance, just beyond the sound of the falling rain, she would hear the soft, mournful sobs of the crying girl of Hollow Creek, weeping for the love she had lost. Don't let this be the last story that leaves you with chills. Like Beth, Ryan, and Lily, you'll want to stay close to the fire for more terrifying tales and ghostly encounters. Subscribe to our channel now, and don't miss out on the next haunting legend that's waiting for you. The Crying Girl of Hollow Creek is only the beginning. Subscribe and keep the nightmares coming. The Rockwell Point Lighthouse had stood at the edge of the cliffs for over a century, a beacon for sailors navigating the dangerous, rocky coastline. It was a lonely place, battered by fierce winds and waves, with the sea stretching endlessly into the horizon. No one ever stayed there for long except for the lighthouse keepers, who lived in isolation, tending the light to keep ships from wrecking on the jagged rocks below. The last keeper, Old Man Barnaby, had died mysteriously decades ago, and the lighthouse had been abandoned ever since. The locals in the nearby village of Tremaine Bay spoke of strange lights seen flickering from the tower at night, even though no one lived there anymore. Some said it was Old Man Barnaby's ghost, still tending to the light as he had in life. Others whispered that the lighthouse itself was cursed, that something darker resided within its walls. Clara, Tom, and Eli, like many of the young people in the village, grew up hearing the stories. They always dismissed them as nothing more than local superstition, but deep down, the mystery of the lighthouse intrigued them. It wasn't until one chilly autumn evening, when boredom got the best of them, that they decided to see it for themselves. "Let's go check it out," Clara suggested, her voice filled with excitement as they huddled in the corner booth of the Seafarers pub. The old tavern smelled of salt water and fish, and the storm outside rattled the windows. Tom raised an eyebrow. "The lighthouse? In this weather?" "Why not?" Clara replied with a grin. "It'll be fun. Besides, don't you want to see if the stories are true?" Eli leaned back in his seat, eyeing her skeptically. "You're not seriously buying into that ghost stuff, are you?" Clara shrugged. "I'm just curious, aren't you?" Tom and Eli exchanged glances, both of them feeling a twinge of unease. The lighthouse had always been a source of fear and fascination in Tremaine Bay, but no one had actually dared to explore it, at least. Not at night. The villagers knew better than to mess with the old legends. But curiosity got the better of them, and soon enough they were trudging through the rain-soaked streets, flashlights in hand, making their way toward the cliffs. The storm had grown worse, the wind howling through the narrow alleys and the rain lashing against their faces as they climbed the winding path that led to the lighthouse. It stood in the distance, a dark silhouette against the stormy sky, the beam from its long dead light eerily absent. Creepy Eli muttered as they neared the base of the tower. The lighthouse loomed over them, its once white walls now stained with age and neglect. The windows were shattered, and the door hung open, creaking in the wind. Clara shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. "Let's just take a quick look around and get out of here." They stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The air was damp and cold, the smell of salt and mildew heavy in the air. The spiral staircase that led to the top of the tower creaked under their weight as they began to climb, their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. "Does anyone else feel like we shouldn't be here?" Tom asked, his voice low. Eli snorted. "You're just scared of a little old lighthouse." But Clara wasn't so sure. The air felt thick with something she couldn't quite explain, a heaviness that made her skin crawl. As they climbed higher, she found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see someone or something following them. They reached the top of the tower, the small room where the light once burned. The storm outside raged on, the wind rattling the broken windows as they stepped inside. The beam from their flashlights swept across the room, revealing the rusted remains of the old light mechanism, covered in dust and cobwebs. Clara's breath fogged in the cold air as she looked around. So much for the ghost of Old Man Barnaby. Tom laughed nervously, but Eli remained silent, his eyes fixed on the large window overlooking the cliffs. "Hey guys," he said slowly, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Look at this." They followed his gaze, and Clara's heart skipped a beat. Far below, on the jagged rocks at the base of the cliffs, a faint light was flickering. It was dim, barely visible through the storm, but it was unmistakably there, a small, glowing orb of light, moving slowly along the shore. "Is someone down there?" Tom asked, squinting through the rain. "Who would be out there in this weather?" Eli replied, shaking his head. "It's impossible." Clara's pulse quickened. Maybe it's one of the fishermen. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. No one would be walking along the cliffs in the middle of a storm like this. No one alive, anyway. As they watched, the light seemed to grow brighter, more erratic. It flickered and danced along the rocks, moving in strange, unnatural patterns, as though it were searching for something. "Let's get out of here," Tom said, backing away from the window. "This isn't right." But before they could move, the light below vanished. For a moment, there was only the sound of the storm, the wind howling through the broken windows. Then, from somewhere deep within the lighthouse, they heard it, a low, rasping whisper. "Help me." Clara's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, almost drowned out by the storm, but it was unmistakable. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. Tom nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it." The whisper came again, closer this time, echoing up the spiral staircase. "Help me." Without thinking, they bolted for the stairs, their flashlights shaking in their hands as they stumbled down the narrow steps. The air seemed to grow colder with every step, the walls closing in around them as the whisper followed, growing louder, more insistent. "Help me." Clara's breath came in ragged gasps as they reached the base of the tower. The door was still open, swaying in the wind, but the light from their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness outside. The storm was worse now, the rain coming down in sheets, and the path back to the village was barely visible. "We need to go," Eli shouted, his voice barely audible over the wind. They stumbled out of the lighthouse and onto the cliffside path, the cold rain stinging their skin as they ran. But even as they fled, Clara could still hear the whisper, carried on the wind. "Help me." They didn't stop running until they reached the village, their hearts pounding, their clothes drenched from the rain. The lights from the houses seemed warm and welcoming, but the memory of the whispering voice stayed with them. None of them spoke as they made their way back to Beth's house, the reality of what they had experienced sinking in. "What was that?" Eli finally asked, his voice trembling. "Did you guys really hear it?" Clara nodded, still shaken. It was him. It had to be. Tom shuddered, wiping the rain from his face. "Old Man Barnaby." "No," Clara said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't him." She didn't know how she knew, but she was certain. The voice they had heard wasn't that of the old lighthouse keeper. It was someone else, someone who had been trapped there for far longer, waiting for anyone to hear their cries for help. As they sat in silence, the storm continued to rage outside, the wind rattling the windows. And in the distance, far out on the cliffs, the light at Rockwell Point flickered once more. The villagers would later say it was nothing more than a trick of the storm. But Clara, Tom, and Eli knew better. They had heard the whisper, felt the cold grip of something ancient and restless. And they knew, deep down, that the lighthouse would never truly be abandoned. There's a place deep in the heart of Gray Ridge Woods that the locals won't go near. It's not marked on any map, but everyone knows it's there, the Whispering Hollow. For as long as anyone in the nearby town of Brentley could remember, the stories about the hollow had been whispered from one generation to the next. It was said to be haunted, a place where lost souls wandered beneath the canopy of twisted trees, their whispers carried on the wind. The most popular tale was of Nathaniel Gray, the man the woods were named after. Over a century ago, Nathaniel had been the town's most respected hunter, a man who knew every inch of the forest. But one day he vanished. Search parties scoured the woods for weeks, But they never found his body, only his hunting knife, discovered deep in Whispering Hollow. Since then, people said they could hear his voice in the woods, calling out for help, warning those who ventured too far to turn back. For Lucas, Amelia, and Jake, the legend was just that, a story. A way to keep the kids of Brentley from exploring too far into the woods. They had spent their childhoods daring each other to sneak as close to the hollow as possible, but they'd never had the courage to actually go in. Now, as teenagers with nothing to prove and a long weekend ahead, they decided it was time to face the legend head-on. "We've talked about this for years," Lucas had said, grinning as they packed their camping gear. "It's just a bunch of stories to scare people. Let's be the ones to say we actually camped in the hollow." Jake was eager to agree. No one's been there in forever. Imagine the looks on people's faces when we tell them we spent the night in Whispering Hollow. Amelia wasn't so sure. "Maybe there's a reason no one goes there," she said, her voice hesitant. "What if the stories are true?" Lucas scoffed, shouldering his backpack. "Come on, Amelia. You're not scared of some old ghost stories, are you?" She wanted to say no, but the truth was, something about the hollow had always unnerved her. Still, she didn't want to back out and leave her friends to explore on their own. So she reluctantly agreed, and together they set off, determined to prove that the legend of Whispering Hollow was nothing more than a myth. The hike into Grey Ridge Woods was easy enough at first. The sun was high in the sky, filtering through the leaves and casting a warm glow on the forest floor. Birds chirped overhead, and the distant rustle of small animals in the underbrush made the woods feel alive, vibrant. They followed the well-worn trail for miles, laughing and joking as they went. But as they neared Whispering Hollow, the atmosphere began to change. The trees grew thicker, their branches twisted together like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. The sunlight struggled to break through the dense canopy, casting everything in a dull, gray light. The birds had stopped singing, and the forest around them fell into an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of their boots on the forest floor. "Feels like we're walking into another world," Jake muttered, glancing around. His earlier bravado had faded, replaced by a growing sense of unease. Amelia said nothing, but she felt it too. The air here was colder, heavier, as though the woods were watching them, waiting for something. After what felt like hours, they finally reached the edge of Whispering Hollow. The hollow itself was a large clearing, surrounded by the tallest, darkest trees they had ever seen. The ground was covered in a thick layer of moss, and in the center of the clearing stood an ancient oak tree, its bark blackened and twisted, as if it had been scorched by fire. A narrow path led deeper into the hollow, disappearing into the shadows. "We made it," Lucas said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He glanced around, his eyes wide with a mix of awe and apprehension. Amelia felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked at the oak tree. Something about it felt wrong, as if it didn't belong there, as if it had been placed in the hollow as a marker, a warning to stay away. "Let's set up camp," Jake suggested, breaking the tense silence. They unpacked their gear, setting up their tents in the clearing near the edge of the hollow. The air was still, unnervingly quiet, and even though it was the middle of the afternoon, the light had dimmed, casting long shadows across the ground. As they worked, Amelia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, half expecting to see someone or something standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the tree line. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, noticing her unease. Amelia forced a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. This place is weird, that's all." Lucas nodded. "It's just a forest. There's nothing out here except trees and legends." But as night began to fall, the weight of the legends pressed down on all of them. They gathered around a small fire, the flickering flames casting eerie shadows on the trees. The air was cool, almost too cold for early fall, and the wind howled through the branches overhead. They tried to keep the mood light, telling stories and roasting marshmallows, but the uneasy silence of the woods kept creeping back in. Finally, Jake couldn't take it anymore. "So when are we going to start listening for the whispers?" he asked, his tone half joking but laced with nervousness. Lucas smirked. "Right about now, I guess." They all fell silent, straining their ears for any sound beyond the crackling of the fire. At first, there was nothing, just the wind and the distant rustle of leaves. But then, faintly, they heard it. A soft, distant whisper, barely audible over the wind. It was impossible to make out any words, but it was there, a low, murmuring sound, like voices carried on the breeze. Amelia's heart raced. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Jake nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I hear it." Lucas's bravado faltered. "It's probably just the wind." But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They came from all around, as if the trees themselves were speaking, their voices rising and falling in a soft, eerie chant. "We need to leave," Amelia said, her voice shaking. "Now." Lucas opened his mouth to argue, but before he could say anything, the fire flickered and went out. They were plunged into darkness, the whispers closing in around them. Amelia fumbled for her flashlight, her hands shaking as she clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the clearing, but something had changed. The trees seemed closer now, their twisted branches reaching toward the center of the hollow. And then, from the shadows beneath the ancient oak, they saw him. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, stood at the base of the tree. He was tall, his clothes tattered and worn, his face hidden beneath the hood. In his hand, he held a hunting knife, its blade glinting in the faint light. "Nathaniel Gray," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. The figure didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his head tilted as if he were listening to something only he could hear. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them, and Amelia felt a cold hand grip her heart. "We need to run," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the whispers. Without waiting for a response, she turned and bolted for the path, her flashlight bobbing wildly as she ran. Lucas and Jake followed close behind, their footsteps pounding against the mossy ground. The whispers followed them, growing louder and more frantic with every step. The wind howled through the trees, and the darkness pressed in around them, making it hard to see the path. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the figure following them, his presence cold and relentless, like a shadow that wouldn't let go. The path seemed longer on the way out, the trees closing in on all sides. The air was thick with the sound of the whispers, and Amelia's mind raced as she tried to remember the way back to the main trail. Finally, after what felt like hours, they burst out of the woods and into the open field beyond. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the air grew still. They collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a long time, none of them spoke. The reality of what had just happened was too much to process. Lucas was the first to break the silence. What the hell was that? Amelia shook her head, still trembling. It was him. It was Nathaniel Gray. Jake stared at the woods, his face pale. "Do you think he was warning us?" Amelia didn't know, but one thing was certain: they weren't going back. Whispering Hollow wasn't just a legend. It was real, and whatever haunted those woods wasn't finished with them. As they made their way back to town, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a soft, faint whisper. They didn't need to hear the words to understand the message. Every town has its secrets, and in the quiet village of Elderbrook, the darkest one belonged to the old doll maker, Joseph Gray. Long ago, he had been famous throughout the region for crafting the most lifelike dolls anyone had ever seen. His dolls were beautiful, delicate, with painted porcelain faces and intricate clothing sewn by hand. People traveled from miles away just to buy one. But after a terrible tragedy, Joseph's once thriving business fell into ruin, and soon after, strange rumors began to spread. It was said that Joseph's wife and daughter had died in a terrible accident, though no one knew the details, and that in his grief he had gone mad. The doll shop closed, and Joseph was never seen again. But his dolls remained, locked away in the old workshop at the edge of town. Over time, the shop became a place of fear and superstition. People claimed to hear strange noises coming from inside, whispers, footsteps, and even the faint sound of a child crying. No one in Elderbrook dared to go near the place, especially after nightfall. But for Emma, Liam, and Zoe, the old doll shop was too tempting to resist. They had grown up hearing the story, passing by the boarded-up building on their way to school, daring each other to peek through the cracked windows. As they got older, the legend of the doll maker and his haunted creations became something they laughed about, a silly story meant to scare children. But the idea of exploring the abandoned shop lingered in their minds, especially on stormy nights when the wind seemed to carry strange whispers through the village. It was on one of those nights, with thunder rumbling in the distance, that they decided to finally see the inside of the shop for themselves. "I can't believe we're actually doing this," Zoe muttered as they approached the old building, the wind tugging at her jacket. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds, and the street was deserted, save for the flickering streetlights casting long shadows. Liam grinned, holding up the flashlight he had brought. "Come on, we've talked about this for years. It's just an old building. What's the worst that could happen?" Emma, the most hesitant of the group, glanced nervously at the boarded-up windows. "People say it's haunted," she whispered. "What if the stories are true?" "They're just stories," Liam said confidently. "Besides, we'll be in and out in no time. We'll take a look around, snap a few pictures, and then we can say we've done it." Reluctantly, Emma nodded, though her stomach twisted with unease. The doll shop loomed in front of them, its once grand facade now cracked and weathered with age. The windows were covered in grime, and the sign that had once proudly displayed Gray's fine dolls was barely legible, the letters faded and peeling. Liam led the way, prying open a loose board that covered the front door. The wood groaned as he pushed it aside, revealing the darkness inside. The air that drifted out from the shop was cold and musty, thick with the smell of dust and decay. Zoe shivered as she stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. "This place is creepy as hell." The inside of the shop was exactly as they had imagined, dusty, forgotten, and filled with shelves upon shelves of dolls. Some were small and delicate, with porcelain faces and glass eyes, while others were larger, their painted expressions frozen in time. Their eyes seemed to follow the trio as they moved deeper into the shop, the beam from their flashlights casting eerie shadows across the floor. Emma shuddered, her eyes flicking nervously from one doll to the next. She had never liked dolls, and now, standing in a room full of them, she felt a growing sense of dread. It was as if the dolls were watching her, their lifeless eyes filled with some hidden, malicious intent. "I don't like this," she whispered. "We should leave." But Liam was already moving toward the back of the shop, where a staircase led up to the second floor. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "We've come this far. Let's see what's upstairs." Reluctantly, Emma and Zoe followed him up the creaking stairs, their footsteps echoing in the empty shop. The second floor was even darker than the first, with only the dim light from their flashlights to guide them. The air was colder here, and the walls were lined with more dolls, hundreds of them, all in various states of disrepair. Why would anyone need this many dolls? Zoe muttered, shining her light over the rows of lifeless faces. Emma didn't answer. Her heart was racing, her skin prickling with the sensation of being watched. Every time she looked at a doll, it seemed like its eyes shifted, just for a second, as if it were alive. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. Can we please leave? I have a really bad feeling about this. Liam was about to respond when they all heard a soft, childlike giggle, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. They froze, their flashlights flickering. Did you hear that? Zoe whispered, her voice trembling. Liam nodded, his bravado suddenly gone. Yeah, I heard it. The giggle came again, louder this time, followed by the sound of small, shuffling footsteps. It was coming from the far end of the hallway, where the door to the doll maker's old workshop stood slightly ajar. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open, revealing the faint outline of a small figure standing in the doorway. At first, they thought it was just another doll, a child-sized figure, dressed in a faded white dress. But then, the figure moved. The girl, if it was a girl, took a step forward, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her long, dark hair obscuring her face. She giggled again, the sound high-pitched and eerie, like a broken music box. We need to go, Emma whispered, her voice shaking with fear. Right now. But before any of them could move, the girl spoke. Play with me, she whispered, her voice soft but filled with an unnatural echo. Won't you play with me? Liam backed away, his eyes wide with terror. What the hell is that? The girl giggled again, taking another step forward. Her hand reached out, the fingers long and thin like porcelain, but her movements were jerky, mechanical. Play with me, she said again, her voice rising in pitch. The dolls on the shelves began to tremble, their glass eyes gleaming in the flickering light. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut, trapping them inside the house. Zoe screamed, grabbing Emma's arm. We have to get out of here. They bolted down the hallway, their footsteps thundering down the stairs as the giggling echoed behind them. The air was thick with the sound of dolls rattling on the shelves, their heads turning to watch as the trio fled through the shop. Liam, hurry, Emma shouted as they reached the front door, their hands fumbling with the board they had moved earlier. But before they could pry it open, the girl appeared at the top of the stairs. Don't leave, she whispered, her voice echoing through the room. You promised to play with me. Her head tilted, her hair falling away from her face to reveal hollow, empty eye sockets. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as she stepped down the stairs, her movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet on strings. Liam, his hands shaking, yanked the door open, and they burst out into the night, the cold air hitting them like a wall. The rain had started to fall, and they ran through the dark streets, not stopping until they reached the safety of Emma's house. They slammed the door shut behind them, gasping for breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. For a long time, none of them spoke. The reality of what they had seen, what they had heard, was too much to comprehend. Finally, Zoe broke the silence. What was that? Emma shook her head, still trembling. I don't know. But it wasn't human. Liam, pale and wide-eyed, stared at the floor. We shouldn't have gone there. We should have listened to the stories. After that night, none of them ever went near the old doll shop again. But the legend of Joseph Gray and his haunted dolls remained. Some say the doll maker had found a way to trap the souls of his wife and daughter in his creations, that their spirits still roamed the shop, waiting for someone to set them free. And every so often, when the wind howled through the streets of Elderbrook, someone would claim to hear the faint sound of a child's laughter, carried on the breeze. The old Greystone Carnival was a place that people avoided in Eerie, abandoned relic just outside of town, overgrown with weeds and rusted attractions that had long fallen into disrepair. 50 years ago, it had been the most popular destination in the area, with families coming from all over to enjoy the rides, games, and food. But after a terrible accident involving one of the carnival's most famous attractions, the Ferris Wheel of Shadows, the entire park was shut down. The accident had claimed the lives of several people, and rumors quickly spread that the carnival was cursed. Some said it was the Ferris wheel itself that was responsible, that something evil had taken root in its rusted gears. Others spoke of strange occurrences, the ghostly laughter of children, the flicker of lights in the dead of night, and the feeling that you were never truly alone within the carnival's decaying walls. No one in Greystone ever went near the carnival anymore. But for Mia, Dylan, and Sophie, the old park was more than just a creepy, forgotten place. It was a challenge. They had grown up hearing the stories, daring each other to sneak inside and explore the grounds at night. But no one had ever actually gone through with it until now. "I'm telling you, it's not haunted," Dylan said, grinning as they stood at the edge of the carnival's rusted gates. The sky above was a deep gray, with dark clouds rolling in, threatening rain. The wind whistled through the dilapidated rides, making the old carousel creak ominously. Mia wasn't so sure. She stared through the bars of the gate, her stomach tightening with unease. "I don't know, Dylan. Something about this place doesn't feel right." Sophie, who had always been the most skeptical of the group, rolled her eyes. "Come on, Mia. It's just an abandoned park. There's nothing here except rusty rides and broken down booths. We'll be in and out in no time." But even Sophie couldn't hide the tension in her voice. The carnival, even in broad daylight, had a strange, suffocating atmosphere. The air felt thick, heavy, as if it were weighed down by the past. The rusted rides loomed like forgotten giants, their once bright colors faded to dull, lifeless hues. The Ferris wheel towered over them, its skeletal frame casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. They climbed over the gate, the metal cold and slick under their hands as they dropped onto the other side. The moment their feet touched the ground, Mia felt a chill creep up her spine. The wind had picked up, rattling the old rides and sending an unsettling creak through the air. Dylan, trying to shake off the unease, led the way toward the heart of the carnival. "Let's check out the Ferris wheel first," he suggested. "It's the whole reason this place is famous, right?" Mia shot him a wary glance. "We're infamous." But Dylan was already heading toward the towering ride, his flashlight flickering in the growing gloom. The Ferris wheel stood at the center of the carnival, its once glorious lights now long extinguished, the seats hanging crookedly from their rusted chains. The wind made the entire structure groan as if it were alive, creaking and swaying with every gust. "Creepy," Sophie muttered, her eyes fixed on the massive wheel. "How did anyone ever think this thing was safe?" Mia shivered, glancing around the deserted grounds. She could almost imagine the carnival as it had been decades ago, full of life, laughter, and the sounds of children running through the park. But now all that remained were the echoes of the past and the oppressive silence of a place long forgotten. As they approached the Ferris wheel, something caught Mia's eye, a flicker of movement near one of the old game booths. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Did you guys see that?" she whispered, her heart racing. Dylan and Sophie turned to look, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the tattered remains of an old shooting gallery, its prizes long since stolen or rotted away. "I didn't see anything," Dylan said, though his voice was quieter now, less certain. Sophie frowned, narrowing her eyes at the booth. "It's probably just an animal. This place is crawling with raccoons and stray cats." Mia nodded, though her skin prickled with unease. "Yeah, maybe." But as they continued walking, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every so often, she would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye, a shadow moving behind one of the rides, a flash of light where there shouldn't have been one. And every time she turned to look, there was nothing there. By the time they reached the Ferris wheel, the wind had picked up even more, howling through the metal beams and sending a shiver down their spines. "We made it," Dylan said, though his voice was strained. He shone his flashlight up at the Ferris wheel, the beam illuminating the rusted frame. "Let's climb up and take a look." Mia's stomach lurched. "Are you crazy? That thing's barely standing as it is." But Dylan was already moving toward the base of the Ferris wheel, grabbing hold of the ladder that led up to the control booth. "Come on," he called over his shoulder. "This is the only chance we'll ever get to see the view from up there." Sophie sighed but followed him, though her steps were more hesitant now. Mia stood frozen in place, staring up at the towering ride. The wind rattled the chains that held the seats, making them sway gently in the breeze. "Something's wrong," Mia whispered to herself, her heart pounding. Just as she was about to call out to her friends, the wind seemed to die down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. The carnival, which had been filled with the sound of creaking metal and rattling chains just moments before, was now deathly quiet. Too quiet. Then, without warning, the Ferris wheel began to move. At first, it was just a small creak, barely noticeable. But then the entire structure groaned, the rusted gears grinding to life as the wheel slowly turned. The empty seats swayed as the wheel rotated, the chains clinking softly in the silence. Mia's breath caught in her throat. "Guys, get down." Dylan and Sophie, halfway up the ladder, froze. They turned to look at Mia, confusion and fear etched on their faces. "What the hell?" Sophie whispered, her eyes wide as the Ferris wheel continued to turn, creaking and groaning as it picked up speed. Dylan scrambled back down the ladder, his face pale. "It shouldn't be moving. There's no power." Mia backed away from the ride, her heart pounding in her chest. "We need to get out of here. Now." The Ferris wheel was spinning faster now, the wind picking up again as the entire structure groaned under the strain. The seats swung wildly, their chains rattling as the wheel turned faster and faster, until it was a blur of rusted metal and empty carriages. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the Ferris wheel stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment, none of them moved. They stood frozen in place, staring up at the ride, their minds racing to make sense of what they had just witnessed. But before they could react, they heard it. A faint, distant sound, like laughter. The soft, eerie sound of children giggling, echoing through the empty carnival. Mia's blood ran cold. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dylan and Sophie nodded, their faces pale. The laughter was growing louder now, closer, as if it were coming from all around them. "Let's go," Dylan said, his voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." They turned and ran, their footsteps pounding against the cracked pavement as they fled from the Ferris wheel. The wind howled around them, carrying the eerie laughter with it, and Mia's heart raced as they darted between the rusted rides and decaying booths. As they ran, Mia glanced over her shoulder, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing near the Ferris wheel, was a group of figures, children, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces pale and expressionless. They stood perfectly still, watching the trio with empty, soulless eyes. Mia's legs burned as she pushed herself to run faster, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Run," she screamed, her voice barely audible over the wind. "They're coming." The laughter grew louder, more frenzied, as the children began to move, their small feet pattering against the ground as they followed. They burst through the gate, scrambling back onto the road and collapsing onto the grass, gasping for breath. The wind died down, and the eerie laughter faded into the distance. For a long time, none of them spoke. They sat in stunned silence, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. What? What was that? Sophie finally asked, her voice trembling. Dylan shook his head, still pale. I don't know. But we're never going back there. Mia nodded, her hands still shaking. We shouldn't have gone in the first place. As they made there. Way back to town, the old carnival stood silent behind them, its rusted rides swaying gently in the breeze. But Mia knew, deep down, that they hadn't been alone in there. The legend of the cursed carnival of Greystone wasn't just a story. And whatever haunted those grounds wasn't finished with them yet. Just like Mia, Dylan, and Sophie barely escaped the horrors of the cursed carnival of Greystone, don't miss out on more terrifying tales that will leave you breathless. Subscribe to our channel for spine-chilling stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. The next tale of horror is just around the corner. Subscribe now, and don't let it pass you by. The Silverbrook orphanage had stood on the outskirts of town for decades, its once grand facade now crumbling and forgotten. For years, it had housed children from all over the region, offering them shelter after losing their families. But after a mysterious fire broke out in the mid-1950s, killing many of the children and staff, the building had been abandoned. No one knew how the fire started, but rumors circulated that something more sinister had caused it. Some said it was the spirits of the forgotten children, seeking revenge for being neglected and abandoned by the town. Now the old orphanage sat in ruin, its windows boarded up, and its doors sealed shut. The children of Silverbrook knew to stay away, but the legend of the haunted orphanage drew people in, daring them to confront the spirits that were said to still linger in the building's dark, decaying halls. For Matt, Haley, and Ben, the story of Silverbrook Orphanage had always been just that, a story. They had heard it growing up, passed from one generation to the next, but none of them truly believed in ghosts. It wasn't until one cold October night, with Halloween just around the corner, that they decided to test the legend for themselves. We've been talking about this for years, Matt said, his breath visible in the cool night air as they stood outside the orphanage. Let's finally see if the stories are true. Haley wasn't so sure. She had always been sensitive to things like this, and the thought of exploring the burned-out remains of the orphanage made her skin crawl. I don't know, Matt, she whispered, her eyes fixed on the building's dark silhouette. What if something really is in there? Ben, the most skeptical of the group, snorted. Come on, Haley. It's an old, burned-down building. The only thing in there is dust and broken furniture. Besides, how many people have said they've gone in and come back out without seeing anything? Haley shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around her. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's safe. Matt flashed her a reassuring smile. We'll just take a quick look around. We'll be in and out, and if it's too creepy, we'll leave right away. Reluctantly, Haley nodded, though the knot of dread in her stomach refused to go away. They approached the orphanage, the air growing colder as they neared the entrance. The once grand archway over the door had crumbled, leaving jagged stones hanging precariously above their heads. The windows were shattered, and ivy had overtaken much of the building's facade, snaking its way up the walls like long, bony fingers. Matt pried open a loose board covering one of the windows, revealing the dark interior of the building. Come on, he whispered, stepping inside and shining his flashlight around the room. This place is a dump. Haley hesitated for a moment before following, her heart pounding in her chest. The inside of the orphanage was even more decayed than she had expected. The walls were blackened with soot, and the smell of mold and rot filled the air. Old furniture, broken and covered in dust, lay scattered across the floor, and the faint outline of long-forgotten toys peeked out from the rubble. This place gives me the creeps, Ben muttered, sweeping his flashlight across the room. Let's just look around and get out of here. They moved deeper into the orphanage, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The air was thick with dust, and every step they took stirred up clouds of debris. The building was deathly silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. "This is the main hall," Matt said, pointing to a large room just ahead. "This is where they used to have assemblies and meals. I read about it online." Haley shone her flashlight toward the center of the room, her stomach turning at the sight. The walls were covered in soot, and the remnants of old, charred furniture lay in heaps around the room. The ceiling had partially collapsed, and moonlight filtered through the broken beams, casting eerie shadows across the floor. Suddenly, Ben stopped in his tracks, his flashlight frozen on one corner of the room. "Did you hear that?" Matt and Haley exchanged nervous glances. "Hear what Matt asked," his voice barely above a whisper. Ben's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. It sounded like someone crying. Haley's breath caught in her throat. "I didn't hear anything." But Ben shook his head, his hand trembling as he gripped the flashlight. "No, I heard it. It was a kid, crying." The room fell silent as they strained their ears, listening for any sound. For a moment, there was nothing, just the distant howl of the wind through the broken windows. And then faintly, they heard it. A soft, muffled sobbing, barely audible but unmistakably coming from somewhere deep within the building. Haley's heart raced. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That can't be real." Matt, always the brave one, forced a nervous laugh. "It's probably just the wind. Old buildings make weird noises." But the sobbing grew louder, more distinct, echoing through the empty halls. "We need to leave," Haley said, her voice shaking. "Right now." But before they could move, the air around them grew colder, so cold that their breath became visible, even inside the building. The temperature had dropped suddenly, unnaturally, and the sobbing continued, now accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. "Matt," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "There's someone here." The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they could hear them coming from the hallway just behind them. Without another word, they bolted for the door, their footsteps pounding against the floor as they raced down the hall. The sound of crying and footsteps followed them, growing louder with every step. The air was thick with the sensation of being watched, and Haley's heart pounded in her chest as she ran, her mind racing with fear. "Get to the door," Matt shouted, his voice barely audible over the sound of their frantic footsteps. They reached the entrance, but just as Matt yanked the door open, it slammed shut on its own with a deafening bang. The impact rattled the walls, and the sound of crying echoed through the orphanage, filling every corner of the building. Haley's hands shook as she grabbed the doorknob, pulling with all her strength, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she cried, her voice filled with panic. "I can't get it open." The sobbing grew louder, more frantic, and the air around them felt suffocating, like they were being surrounded by an unseen presence. "We need to find another way out," Matt said, his voice tight with fear. "There's got to be another door." They ran back down the hall, their flashlights flickering as they searched for an exit. Every door they tried was locked, and the crying seemed to follow them, coming from everywhere at once. Haley's heart raced as they rounded a corner and stumbled into what looked like an old dormitory. The room was filled with rows of tiny beds, most of them blackened by the fire. Toys and children's clothes lay scattered across the floor, covered in dust. The air was heavy with the smell of smoke, and the walls were charred, as if the fire had happened just days ago. Haley felt a lump rise in her throat as she shone her flashlight over the beds. And then out of the corner of her eye, she saw a small figure standing at the far end of the room. It was a little girl. Her hair was matted, her clothes tattered and covered in soot. Her face was pale, and her eyes were hollow, empty voids that stared at them from across the room. She stood perfectly still, her small hands clutching a burned teddy bear to her chest. Haley's breath caught in her throat. "Do you see her?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Matt and Ben turned to look, their faces pale with terror. The little girl didn't move, but her presence filled the room, the air thick with sorrow and pain. Suddenly, the little girl tilted her head, her hollow eyes locking onto Haley's. "Help us," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with despair. Haley stumbled backward, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "We need to get out of here," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. The girl took a step forward, her eyes pleading. "Help us." Without another word, they turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the empty orphanage. The air was thick with the sound of crying, now dozens of voices, all children, all weeping, their sobs filling every room, every hallway. They raced through the building, their breaths coming in short, panic gasps as they searched for a way out. Finally, they found a window, the glass cracked but still intact. Matt grabbed a piece of debris and smashed the window, the sound of shattering glass breaking through the eerie cries. "Go," he shouted, helping Haley and Ben climb through the window before scrambling out himself. They tumbled onto the cold ground outside, gasping for breath as they ran toward the safety of the trees. The orphanage loomed behind them, silent. Once more, the cries fading into the night. For a long time, they stood in stunned silence, their hearts racing, their minds struggling to process what they had just experienced. What? What were they? Ben whispered, his voice trembling. Haley wiped a tear from her cheek. They were the children, the ones who died in the fire. They're still there. Matt nodded, his face pale. "We should have never gone in." As they made their way back to town, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the faint, sorrowful sound of children's cries. Like Matt, Haley, and Ben barely escaped the haunting cries of Silverbrook Orphanage. You won't want to miss the next terrifying tale we have in store for you. Subscribe now to our channel and experience more spine-chilling ghost stories and paranormal encounters that will leave you breathless. The next haunting is just a click away. Subscribe today. High on a hill overlooking the small town of Ravensbrook, the old Ravensbrook Manor stood as a forgotten relic of a dark and mysterious past. Built in the early 1800s, it had once been the grand home of the Hollister family, one of the wealthiest in the region. But over the years, tragedy after tragedy had struck the family, with each generation more ill-fated than the last. It wasn't long before the townspeople began whispering about a curse that had befallen the estate. After the last Hollister died under mysterious circumstances, the manor was abandoned, left to crumble and rot. No one dared go near it, especially after nightfall. For years, Ravensbrook Manor had been a place of eerie fascination for the younger residents of the town. Legends of strange noises, ghostly figures, and unexplainable lights at night filled the local lore. But none of those stories had ever been proven true, at least, not by anyone who came back to tell about it. Despite the warnings, Sam, Olivia, and Noah decided to explore the manor themselves. They had always been drawn to the mysterious, and the manor's long history of tragedy made it the ultimate haunted location. As Halloween approached, the idea of spending a night in the manor became too tempting to resist. "We've heard the stories for years," Sam said, standing at the base of the hill, staring up at the towering structure. The windows were shattered, the once grand stone facade now covered in ivy. But no one's actually gone inside in decades. It's just a house. Olivia wasn't so sure. She had always been more cautious, more attuned to the supernatural. "You know the stories, Sam. They say the Hollisters were cursed. Every single one of them died under mysterious circumstances." Noah laughed, nudging her playfully. "That's just old town gossip. People love to turn tragedies into ghost stories. But Olivia's face remained serious. It's not just gossip. People say they've seen things, shadows, lights, and they've heard voices. I don't think we should mess with it. Sam, always the bold one, rolled his eyes. Come on, Olivia. It's just an empty house. What's the worst that could happen? With a reluctant sigh, Olivia agreed, though the knot of dread in her stomach only tightened as they made their way up the hill. The manor loomed over them like a dark, forgotten giant, its long abandoned windows like empty eyes watching their approach. They reached the front door, the heavy wood splintered and covered in moss. The old iron knocker, once polished and ornate, was now rusted and hanging loosely from the door. Sam pushed the door open with a creak, the sound echoing through the empty halls like a warning. The air inside was cold, much colder than outside, and carried the unmistakable scent of decay and neglect. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the chandeliers like delicate threads of forgotten time. Noah shined his flashlight around the large entryway, revealing a grand staircase that curved up to the second floor. This place must have been amazing back in the day, he said, his voice low. Look at that staircase. It's like something out of a movie. Olivia, her eyes wide with unease, couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. I don't like this. It's too quiet. Sam, ignoring her concern, motioned for them to follow him deeper into the house. Come on, let's check out the rest of the place. I want to see the library. They moved through the darkened halls, their footsteps echoing unnervingly. The house was huge, with dozens of rooms, each one more decayed and forgotten than the last. Portraits of the long-dead Hollister family members hung on the walls, their eyes following the group as they moved. Creepy, Noah muttered, shining his flashlight on one of the portraits. The painting was of a woman in her late 20s, her expression somber, her eyes dark and haunting. It feels like she's staring right at us. Olivia shivered, averting her gaze. Can we please get out of here? But Sam wasn't ready to leave just yet. One more room, he said, pushing open the door to what had once been the manor's grand library. The room was massive, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with dust-covered volumes. A large fireplace dominated one wall, its stone hearth blackened with age. Heavy drapes, moth-eaten and faded, hung over the tall windows, barely allowing the moonlight to filter through. Noah whispered, "This place is incredible." Olivia, however, felt a chill creep up her spine. There was something wrong with this room, something cold and dark, as though it were filled with a presence she couldn't see but could feel all around her. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Something's not right here." But Sam was already wandering deeper into the room, his flashlight flickering slightly as he moved toward the far end of the library. "Just 1 minute," he called over his shoulder. "I want to check something out." As Sam approached the far wall, a strange creaking sound echoed through the room, like wood shifting under pressure. He froze, his flashlight flickering again, this time more violently. "Did you hear that?" Noah asked, his voice tight with fear. Before anyone could answer, the heavy door behind them slammed shut with a deafening bang. Olivia screamed, spinning around to grab the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked," she cried, her heart racing. "We're trapped." Suddenly, the room grew colder, and a faint whisper filled the air, too quiet to understand but unmistakably there. "Sam," Noah shouted, his flashlight flickering as he ran toward him. "We need to get out of here." Sam, his face pale, backed away from the far wall, his eyes wide with terror. "There's something in here," he whispered, his voice shaking. I saw a shadow." The whispers grew louder, filling the room with a soft, eerie chant that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The temperature dropped even further, and the air grew thick with a cold, oppressive energy that made it hard to breathe. "We need to leave," Olivia shouted, pounding on the door. "Let us out." But the door remained locked, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. Noah, his hands shaking, shone his flashlight toward the fireplace, and then he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, stood near the hearth. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her face. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids, and her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. "No," Noah whispered, stumbling backward. "That can't be real." The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, her eyes locked on Noah. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, filling the room with a deafening hum that made it impossible to think. Olivia screamed as the figure moved closer, her hollow eyes flickering with a strange, unnatural light. "Please," Olivia cried, pounding on the door with all her strength. "Let us out." But before anyone could move, the figure vanished, leaving the room eerily silent. For a moment, none of them spoke. They stood frozen in place, their hearts pounding in their chests, their minds racing to make sense of what had just happened. Suddenly, the door creaked open, as if released by some unseen force. Without thinking, they bolted for the exit, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls as they fled the manor. They didn't stop running until they reached the bottom of the hill, gasping for breath, their hearts still racing. The manor loomed behind them, silent and dark, its empty windows like watching eyes. What? What was that? Noah whispered, his voice trembling. Sam shook his head, still pale. "I don't know. But I saw her. She was real." Olivia wiped a tear from her cheek, her hands still shaking. That was one of the Hollisters. It had to be. As they stood there trying to catch their breath, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, eerie whisper. It was the same chant they had heard inside the library, and it seemed to echo from the manor, growing louder as it reached their ears. They never returned to Ravensbrook Manor. The stories they had heard all their lives were no longer just stories, they were warnings. And whatever haunted that old house wasn't finished with them yet. In the small, fog-drenched town of Blackmore, one legend stood above the rest, the story of the night watcher of Blackmore Bridge. For decades, locals had whispered about the eerie figure that appeared on stormy nights, standing on the bridge, overlooking the rushing waters below. The stories varied. Some said he was the ghost of a man who had drowned in the river, while others believed he was a malevolent spirit, cursed to guard the bridge and keep others from crossing it. Whatever the truth, there was one part of the legend that everyone agreed on: those who saw the night watcher were never the same again. Some people vanished without a trace, while others came back shaken and disturbed, unable to speak of what they had seen. Alex, Jenna, and Ethan had grown up hearing the tale, passed down by their grandparents, who had heard it from their own parents. Like most people in Blackmore, they had always dismissed it as nothing more than a ghost story, until one night, when curiosity got the best of them. With the wind howling outside and the rain beating down on the streets, they decided to venture out to Blackmore Bridge and see if the legend was true. "Come on, it's just an old story," Alex said, pulling his hood tighter against the rain as they made their way down the narrow road toward the bridge. "People around here just love to scare themselves." Jenna wasn't convinced. "Yeah, but my grandpa swore he saw something when he was a kid. He always said there was something evil about that bridge." Ethan, the most skeptical of the group, snorted. "Please. If there was really something haunting the bridge, don't you think we'd know by now? People drive over it every day, and nothing happens." But as they approached the bridge, even Ethan couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over them, like the mist rolling in from the river. The bridge itself was old, ancient, even its stone archway slick with rain, and the water below churned violently in the storm. "I don't know, guys," Jenna whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Something doesn't feel right. Alex, ever the brave one, shrugged off her concern. Let's just walk across, see if anything happens, and get out of here. We'll be back in time to tell everyone it was all just a bunch of nonsense. The three of them stepped onto the bridge, their footsteps echoing on the wet stone. The rain fell harder now, stinging their faces as they moved further across. The river roared beneath them, the current swift and unforgiving, and the wind howled through the archways, creating an eerie, hollow sound that seemed to come from all directions. See, Ethan called over the storm. Nothing's here, just like I said. But Jenna wasn't so sure. As they neared the center of the bridge, she slowed her steps, her eyes scanning the shadows that stretched across the stones. Something felt wrong more than just the storm, more than just the old legends. It was as if the air itself had changed, thickening around them, pressing in on all sides. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the bridge, shrouded in mist and rain. Jenna froze, her breath catching in her throat. Alex. Ethan. Look. They turned to follow her gaze, their eyes widening as they saw what she had seen. The figure was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a long coat, though it was hard to make out any details through the storm. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat, his head bowed slightly as he stood perfectly still, as if waiting for them. Who the hell is that? Ethan whispered, his earlier bravado gone. Alex narrowed his eyes, trying to get a better look. Maybe it's just some guy. A fisherman, maybe. But even as he said it, Alex knew it wasn't true. The figure didn't move, didn't react to the wind or rain. He simply stood there, watching them, or at least that's what it felt like. We should leave, Jenna said, her voice trembling. Now. But before they could turn back, the figure took a step forward. Alex's heart raced. Who are you? He called, though his voice was barely audible over the storm. The figure didn't respond. He just kept walking, slow and deliberate, his boots making no sound as they touched the wet stone. With each step, the air around them seemed to grow colder, the wind biting at their skin. Let's go, Ethan whispered urgently, grabbing Jenna's arm. We need to get out of here. They turned and ran, their footsteps slapping against the slick stone as they raced back toward the town. The wind howled in their ears, and the rain came down in sheets, making it hard to see. But even as they fled, they could feel that the figure was following them. Jenna glanced over her shoulder, her heart pounding in her chest. The night watcher was closer now, moving faster than he should have been, his long coat billowing in the wind as he closed the distance between them. She could see his face now, or at least the place where his face should have been. There was nothing there, just darkness. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself to run faster, the terror rising in her throat like bile. He's coming, she screamed, her voice barely audible over the storm. He's right behind us. They reached the edge of the bridge and stumbled onto the road, gasping for breath. For a moment, the storm seemed to let up, the wind dying down just enough for them to hear the pounding of their hearts in the silence that followed. But when they looked back, the night watcher was gone. The bridge stood silent and empty, the only sound the rushing of the river below and the distant rumble of thunder. What was that? Ethan whispered, his face pale and dripping with rain. Jenna shook her head, still trembling. I don't know, but it wasn't human. Alex, his hands shaking, wiped the rain from his face. We need to tell someone. People need to know there's something out there. But who would believe them? The legend of the Night Watcher had been told for generations, but it had always been dismissed as just a story, a way to keep people from venturing out onto the bridge during storms. No one would believe that they had seen him, that he had followed them. As they made their way back to town, the wind picked up again, and the rain began to fall harder. But even as they walked, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that the night watcher hadn't really left. For weeks after their encounter, all three of them had the same nightmare, standing on Blackmore Bridge, unable to move, while the night watcher slowly approached, his face a blank, empty void. And every time they awoke, they felt as though they had brought something back with them. Just like Alex, Jenna, and Ethan barely escaped the night watcher of Blackmore Bridge, you won't want to miss out on more terrifying tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Subscribe to our channel now for spine-tingling ghost stories, urban legends, and haunted encounters that will leave you breathless. The next chilling story is just a click away. Subscribe today.